Chapter 200. Retreat. Retreat quickly. Elder Dao shouted and quickly retreated. He didn't bring all the people of the Hehuan sect tonight. He didn't expect to encounter such a dilemma. Suddenly, he sniffed. Although the rain covered it, he still smelled a very slight rancid smell under the robe of the black-robed man. Corpse puppet. It turned out to be a corpse puppet. Elder Dao suddenly realized and then shouted angrily, "Liansha cult, you and I are irreconcilable." Every move of the 8 inborn corpse puppets was a killing move. In the blink of an eye, many people around him died. After the news spread to the sect, he didn't know whether he could keep his position as an elder or not. Just when Elder Dao thought that he had escaped from the attack range of the corpse puppet, a bright sword light flashed behind him. Crack! A bloody arm was cut off and fell into the muddy pool. Ah! Elder Dao screamed and went away in an instant. He didn't care about the people around him and fled alone. Without the protection of the elder, a group of people who had just reached the first or second hurdle of the inborn hurdle were quickly slaughtered by the corpse puppets. Fang Yuan lifted his bamboo hat and went to the roadside to pick up the broken arm. He poured the genuine energy into it. The next moment, Elder Dao's right arm burst into blood mist with a bang sound. After doing this, Fang Yuan glanced at Dongfang Rui, who was looking at him. He jumped onto the eaves and disappeared without any hesitation. If he could, he preferred to hold the umbrella quietly for Su Li. Of course, he was also very happy to help Su Li to frame others. Everyone disappeared, leaving only corpses on the ground. Dongfang Rui took a deep breath. There was a faint horror in his eyes. Was that the arrangement that Su Li said? She had such a senior around her. Fang Yuan returned to Su Li and took the umbrella handle from her hand. Su Li said with a smile, "You are in the 3rd hurdle of the inborn hurdle, but you can cut off the arm of a person in the 5th hurdle of the inborn hurdle. Your AO sword skills have made good progress." Fang Yuan slightly smiled and bowed his head. "There are still many things that I don't understand. I just mastered a little bit. I am not much different from you. In the future, we can exchange experiences with each other. Maybe we can have new gains." As she said, Su Li suddenly looked in another direction. Next, it's time to see what the Liansha cult is made of. Under the curtain of rain, a group of black-clothed and masked men were running quickly on the rooftops. There were 42 of them, and all of them were at the innate realm. Soon, they were close to the Wu family's mansion. The leader of the masked men looked vigilant and looked around. He was much more careful than Elder Dao. The auction fair was about to begin. Nobody knew how deep the situation in Yunjing City was. At this moment, they naturally wanted to fish in troubled waters. If they could reduce the fighting power of other forces, it would be the best. As for the Wu family, if the Wu family didn't die out completely, they would naturally become Lei Feng and help. After all, they were close to the 3rd prince. At this moment, they did not know that before they arrived, their whereabouts had been completely exposed by Elder Dao's roar. Turning the corner, they could still smell the strong smell of blood in the rain. The leader of the black-masked men saw the gap where the royal guards surrounded the Wu family. He was delighted and was about to lead his men to jump over. But at this moment, countless silver needles were mixed with the drizzle and shrouded all the black-clothed men like a storm. The leader of the black-clothed men snorted and immediately manipulated the corpse puppets to block the silver needles. The 12 people also followed suit and put the corpse puppets in front of them. In the next moment, all the corpse puppets in front of them were pierced into hedgehogs, and none of the needles fell on the living people. "You rascal, who gave you the courage to attack me?" The leader of the black-clothed men made a ferocious voice and manipulated the 8 corpse puppets to rush to the source of the silver needles. But he didn't rush for a few steps. There was a continuous sound of plop behind him. He looked back in amazement and found that all his men were in a coma. No one controlled the corpse puppets, so they naturally became dead. What's going on? The leader of the black-clothed men was shocked. They clearly dodged all the silver needles. Then, the leader of the black-clothed men fell down with his head up and fainted. Su Li stood on the edge of the eaves and flicked her sleeves to shoot all kinds of weapons. She shot all the vital parts of the black-clothed men, except for the leader of the black-clothed men. In the twinkling of an eye, the blood converged into a river along with the patter of the rain. Ling Li sat in the room and watched the scrolls of intelligence sent by the people of the Tianya house. He fell into a long silence. Someone did what he always wanted to do. Then, the Lianxia cult and the Hehuan sect would definitely turn against each other and fight to the death. But he didn't know who did it. Master, maybe they really met each other and the situation was chaotic. Then, it evolved into a big scuffle. Ling Xian gently touched the wrinkles between Ling Li's eyebrows. Ling Li pushed her away without a trace, which made the smile on her face stiff. Ling Li stood up and stood by the window. He would not have the naive idea like Ling Xian. There must be someone manipulating this matter to make all the advantages fall to their side. This person stood on their side, but was unwilling to show up. Ling Li held his breath slightly. He thought of a person. In the second half of the night, more sects emerged. They weakened their strength by the chaos. Under Su Li's manipulation, no one got any benefit in the end. All of them were seriously injured. There was a glimmer of light in the sky. What was hidden in the darkness disappeared with the fading darkness, leaving only corpses on the street. Dongfang Rui looked tired, but his eyes were bright. Looking at the dead Wu family, he turned his stiff neck and asked hoarsely, "Where is Wu Lirong?" Wu Bin's face was covered with blood. He walked over and said with a bitter smile, "I found her, but, then, he asked someone to carry a corpse over. When I found her, she was already a corpse. Last night, it was very chaotic. I don't know who killed her." Looking at Wu Lirong who had already died, Dongfang Rui pulled out the long sword from his waist and cut off Wu Lirong's head. When the blood spilled, he wrapped it carefully and held it in his arms. This time, he breathed a long sigh of relief. "Go back. It's enough." "Yes, master," Wu Bin said and retreated quickly with his people, leaving only the broken wall of the Wu family covered with blood. Wu Suijun sat upright in the center of the main room and didn't move all night. It seemed that the people of Lord Rui's mansion didn't see him at all. They broke into the Wu family wantonly and killed all the non-lineal descendants. Except that Wu Lirong died miserably and her corpse was taken away, Dongfang Rui had a sense of propriety. The main family of the Wu family didn't suffer much loss. But Wu Suijun would never be grateful for Dongfang Rui's mercy. Besides the Ling family, the Wu family had another deadly enemy, Lord Rui's mansion. After the people of Lord Rui's mansion left, a large number of city guards appeared and began to clean the street and carry the corpses. Hu Daiden ordered people to carry the corpses away and couldn't help but be shocked. It turned out that the seemingly gentle Lord Rui was so horrible when he went crazy. There were 500 corpses near the Wu family. The emperor acquiesced Lord Rui to commit such a crime. I didn't expect that the relationship between Lord Rui and the emperor was so good. Hu Daiden muttered to himself and sighed in his heart. The day before Lord Rui took action, he received an order from his superior that no matter what happened to Lord Rui, he shouldn't take action. He thought that according to Lord Rui's temperament, he would kill dozens of people at most. He didn't expect that the real number was 10 times that he guessed. At this moment, Dongfang Xiao, who had just got up and washed, was eating breakfast with the help of a maid. Suddenly, he received the news from Hu Daiden. He was so shocked that he almost spat out blood. He was not shocked because of the 500 lives, but because Dongfang Rui actually gave a false order and slaughtered the Wu family in his name. All the collateral descendants of the Wu family were killed by Dongfang Rui. This enmity was too great. He just wanted Dongfang Rui to beat the Wu family a little bit. He even guessed that in that complicated situation, Dongfang Rui would give up even if he couldn't kill a maid of the Wu family. But when he woke up one night, he got the news that Dongfang Rui killed all the people of the Wu family except for the lineal descendants. Even the maids and servants were not spared. Is Dongfang Rui crazy? Just for a woman who has been dead for more than 10 years. Dongfang Xiao stood up angrily and overturned the table. Then he coughed violently. Eunuch Feng was so shocked that he immediately called the imperial doctor. After calming down, Dongfang Xiao looked gloomy and sighed to himself, "I'm old. I can't even out-scheme others." After thinking for a while, he understood. Dongfang Rui could be used as a tool by him. Naturally, He could be used by others. Obviously, someone gave Dongfang Rui advice and told him how to take revenge. Dongfang Rui was impulsive and didn't think about the consequences. The Wu family has been greatly weakened. The Ling family also has few talents. Now, the Ma family dominates. Ho ho, Dongfang Xiao's smile was very cold. Eunuch Feng trembled. Was it the Ma family who did this? But the Ma family had always been loyal to the emperor. The position of the emperor is really attractive. Everyone wants to sit on it. Dongfang Xiao sat up reluctantly and thought deeply. The Ling family and the Wu family are like fire and water. Instead of letting them unite to deal with the Ma family, it is better to consider strengthening the strength of one of them. The eighth brother of the Wu family acts rashly. I am afraid that he has rebelled against me. The Ling family is loyal and can be used. After making up his mind, Dongfang Xiao cheered up and said, "Summon General Ling Ping to the imperial palace." "Yes, sir." On the day when the whole city was in chaos because of the Wu family, Ling Ping inexplicably took the position of the Defender General of the state. It was the glory of his father. That was to say, his current status was no worse than that of Prime Minister Ma and Prime Minister Tang. His military power even exceeded that of Wu Suijun, but during this time, he stayed in Yunjing and did nothing. In the past few years, he had been fighting outside and won many battles. The imperial palace always gave him 1,000 taels of gold and so on. He didn't hear the news of promotion. Do I have to stay in Yunjing city obediently if I want to promote my military rank? For a moment, General Ling Ping was at a loss. Ling Li, who knew the whole process, got the news. Although he was a little surprised, he was not very shocked. Dongfang Xiao needed to balance the big families in his hands. The mansion of Prime Minister Tang had always been prominent, but Dongfang Xiao seemed to put it out of his consideration. Now Dongfang Rui's raid on the Wu family was a great success, and the strength of the Wu family was weakened to the bottom. Out of Dongfang Xiao's expectation, Dongfang Xiao urgently promoted Ling Ping's military rank so that the status of the Ling family and the Ma family could be equal. As for Ling Ping's military merits, he had already accumulated enough under his arrangement. But Dongfang Xiao pretended not to know and delayed promoting Ling Ping. Thinking of this, Ling Li smiled. The person who secretly helped him really helped him a lot. Chapter 201. The next morning assembly. Civil and military officials gathered from all directions of Yunjing city. Different from the usual noisy atmosphere, this time everyone came and stood silently, waiting for the morning court to start. As the hour approached, Wu Suijun's figure finally appeared outside the palace gate slowly. All the officials who saw him changed their expressions slightly, because Wu Suijun was not wearing an official robe, but a military uniform for killing enemies on the battlefield. He didn't bring a knife. Some people secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Anyone who was like Wu Suijun, whose family was confiscated inexplicably, would go crazy. It was disrespectful for Wu Suijun to wear a military uniform, but the fact that he didn't bring a knife proved that he hadn't lost his mind. Wu Suijun walked straight into the hall of the palace gate and stood in the second seat on the right below the throne. Many people had their own thoughts. Today, Wu Suijun came prepared. It seemed that the morning assembly would be lively. The emperor is here. Suddenly, Eunuch Feng walked to the front of the throne and shouted. His deep voice resounded throughout the palace hall. For a moment, all the officials saluted and shouted, "Long live your majesty! Long live your majesty!" Ling Ping was promoted to a general, and his official rank was the same as Wu Suijun's. He stood in the second position on the left, which happened to be the same as Wu Suijun's. He lowered his head slightly and glanced at Wu Suijun's cold face. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. After such a tragedy happened in his family, he could still keep so calm. His scheming was really incomparable. After a while, Dongfang Xiao, wearing a dragon robe, walked to the throne step by step with his back bent. He waved his sleeves and sat down slowly. He glanced at all the officials present, showing the majesty of the emperor of Dahan country. Eunuch Feng glanced at Wu Suijun and said as usual, "If you have something to say, report it in advance. If not, dismiss." As soon as the words came out, the whole palace was silent. Everyone's eyes were focused on Wu Suijun. The next moment, Wu Suijun stepped out of the crowd and saluted respectfully. He raised his head and revealed a pair of cold eyes. "I report it in advance." Dongfang Xiao seemed to be dim-sighted. He just saw Wu Suijun's armor and pretended to be surprised. "What's the matter? What about your armor?" Seeing the emperor's reaction, Wu Suijun's face darkened slightly. Dongfang Xiao pretended to be ignorant, which was clearly to make him suffer, but he didn't. "Tell 8th Lord, Dongfang Rui." He borrowed the emperor's name to charge into this official's residence and kill the innocent. None of the collateral relatives of the Wu family survived. Although my sister Wu Lirong deserved to die, her head was cut off by Dongfang Rui. It was really heartless. I hope that your majesty will uphold justice for this official and punish him. Wu Suijun's tough attitude made the gentleness on Dongfang Xiao's face disappear gradually. He lowered his head and touched the ring in his hand, saying absent-mindedly, "So you are talking about this." Although Wu Lirong went too far to chase after the royal princess without permission. However, Prince Rui also did something wrong in this matter. "Little Fengzi." Eunuch Feng immediately answered, "Your Majesty, I'm here." Dongfang Xiao nodded and said in a low voice, "8th Lord, come to the hall." "Your Majesty's oral order, select a web page, come to the hall." The eunuch's voice spread through the palace. Wu Suijun's face became more and more gloomy. Dongfang Xiao pointed out what Wu Lirong had done. How could he continue to stand on the side of righteousness? Assaulting the royal princess was a serious crime that would lead to the confiscation of the property and beheading of the head. That was to say, Wu Lirong took advantage of Su Yun before he married into the Wu family. But if he really cared about it, the Wu family had no chance to win. Was Dongfang Xiao really going to beat him down like how he beat the Ling family before? Wu Suijun's thoughts changed rapidly. He wore a military uniform to remind the emperor of the Wu family's contribution to the Han dynasty. But if Dongfang Xiao was really afraid of the Wu family, his action would be regarded as taking advantage of the emperor's favor, which would make Dongfang Xiao more unhappy. Taking a deep breath, Wu Suijun suppressed his anger. Although he was very angry that the collateral relatives of the Wu family were destroyed, he had to adjust his mentality since Dongfang Xiao's attitude towards the Wu family had changed. He didn't want to sacrifice the real Wu family for those unimportant children and servants. After a short wait, Dongfang Rui answered the summons. But the clothes he wore made all the officials horrified. Another more ruthless one came. Dongfang Rui was in mourning. His face was pale and his eyes were red. The tears on his face had not dried yet. It seemed that he had just cried. Wu Suijun's eyes twitched violently. He opened his mouth but dared not to ridicule him. Ma Xiong and Ma De laughed in their hearts. Today, Wu Suijun's clothes were much whiter. Walking to Wu Suijun, Dongfang Rui pursed his pale lips and bowed his head. "Greetings, my brother." Dongfang Xiao showed concern on his face. He stood up and said hurriedly, "Brother Rui, quickly bow to the emperor." "Why are you wearing mourning clothes? You also look terrible. I know you are sad, but remember to take care of your body. Come, take a seat." Eunuch Feng, ask the imperial doctor to check Lord Rui. Don't let him be too sad and hurt his body. "Yes, your majesty." Eunuch Feng lowered his head obediently, but he was very confused. This time, the 8th prince faked the emperor's oral order. The emperor should be angry when he saw it. Why didn't he get angry? Instead, he showed a brotherly look. Dongfang Rui was also confused about this. But this time, he was used by Dongfang Xiao. So, he was alert enough. He showed a trace of gratitude on his sad face. He sat on the octagonal chair moved by the eunuch and said, "Thank you for your understanding, my brother. I am going to worship the princess. The imperial palace summoned me urgently. I have no time to change my clothes. So, I have to offend you." As soon as Dongfang Rui said that, Prime Minister Ma and Prime Minister Tang rolled their eyes at the same time. It would take an hour to go from Lord Rui's mansion to the imperial palace. However, Dongfang Rui arrived in less than a quarter of an hour. He was a talent to lie so calmly. It was said that Lord Rui was a rare honest member of the royal family. Now it seemed to be a lie. I see. Dongfang Xiao was suddenly enlightened. Then, he looked sad. He said, "The princess has passed away for many years. Brother Rui, don't be too sad. You have just found the princess. You should take good care of your body and raise the princess well." "Thank you, my brother." The two of them did not mention anything about the Wu family at all, but instead talked about the memorial service for Su Yun. It was clear that the atmosphere between the two of them was harmonious, but all the officials in the court had goosebumps all over their bodies, their hearts trembling in fear. This was the first time that the emperor admitted the identity of Su Yun as the princess. In addition, Wu Lirong chased after them. Didn't it mean that the Wu family had committed a big crime? The more Wu Suijun listened, the worse he felt. He regretted mentioning Dongfang Rui. Since Dongfang Xiao started it, would he carry out the immature plan in advance today? But at this moment, Dongfang Xiao suddenly turned his head. His voice became cold and resounded in the court. "Wu Suijun, do you know your crime?" Plop. Wu Suijun knelt down without saying a word. His forehead was covered with cold sweat. He didn't look as righteous as before. "I know my crime." Wu Suijun's sudden change shocked all the officials. They thought that Wu Suijun would quibble. Unexpectedly, he confessed. Dongfang Xiao was surprised. He narrowed his turbid eyes slightly and continued to ask in a slow tone, "Then tell me, what crime did you commit?" Wu Suijun thought quickly and tried to figure out Dongfang Xiao's mind. He knew his current situation. If he said something wrong, he might be doomed eternally. Dongfang Rui sat in the chair. The fear he had when he just entered the palace faded away. As Su Li said, Dongfang Xiao didn't mention anything about his false oral edict. Instead, he stood on the same side and began to attack the Wu family. However, Su Li said that if Wu Suijun was smart enough. At this moment, Wu Suijun said, "I committed the crime of concealing the truth and not reporting it. At that time, my sister used the force in the mansion to attack Princess Rui without authorization. Later, she hired warriors in Jianghu to hunt her down. It was a terrible crime. A few years later, my sister told me that I made a big mistake because I cherished my sister and wanted to save her life. Your Majesty, please punish me." When he said this, the hall was so quiet that even a needle falling could be heard. Wu Lirong was dead. The dead could not speak. Wu Suijun put all the blame on his sister. How could he say that he cherished his sister? Many officials were shocked by Wu Suijun's ruthlessness and decisiveness. Dongfang Xiao hid the fear in his eyes. Wu Suijun was indeed a little scheming. He was much more difficult to deal with than the Ling family. "Wu Suijun, if your sister was still alive, she would definitely be sentenced to death by dismembering her body to uphold the law. You also made a big mistake because of your sister. But for the sake of your sincere confession and the fact that you didn't know it in the early years, I will demote you to a third-grade general. You will march the army to the border of Nanjiang country and make up for your crime by guarding the border of Dahan country. How about it?" Wu Suijun's expression changed. Finally, he gritted his teeth and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." He was a third-grade general, while Ling Ping was promoted to the second-grade general yesterday. He never thought that his official rank would fall below that of Ling Ping. However, at this moment, no matter how angry and resentful he was, he could only grit his teeth and swallow it. Wu Suijun lowered his head. Dongfang Xiao smiled again. He turned to Dongfang Rui and said in a low voice, "Brother Rui, you also made a mistake. No matter what, you can't vent your anger on ordinary servants. Otherwise, the Dongfang family will become a cruel royal family in the eyes of the world. You are right. I am willing to accept any punishment for what I did on impulse." Dongfang Rui did not mean to disobey Dongfang Xiao, although the so-called ordinary servants were not ordinary. Dongfang Xiao narrowed his eyes and nodded, "Then you will not go to the morning court for 3 months and be deprived of a year's salary. Go back and reflect on yourself." Wu Suijun knelt on the ground and lowered his head. When he heard the punishment, his eyelids couldn't help but tremble. What Dongfang Xiao gave Dongfang Rui was not a punishment, but a disguised vacation. In addition, Lord Rui hadn't come to the morning court for more than 10 years. As for the salary, Lord Rui had an auction house and the Baisho building. How could he be short of salary? Brother, I accept the punishment. As Dongfang Rui nodded to express his gratitude, this sentence was written on the morning court. All the civil and military officials had the same thought. The emperor really treated Prince Rui so well that there was nothing to say. Only Prime Minister Tang looked thoughtful. The ending of the morning court seemed calm, but it was dangerous. He really worried about Lord Rui. He had lived for so many years and experienced the changes of emperors. How could he not know the relationship between Dongfang Rui and Dongfang Xiao? Now, for the princess who had died many years ago, he really risked his life. Such a temperament, but he was born in the royal family. Chapter 202. The setting sun was beside the intestines, and the horse was beside. Wu Suijun glanced at the old and the young in the family and finally fixed his eyes on Wu Jin. Without saying anything, he mounted the horse and left, stirring up the dust. Wu Jin took a deep breath, and his eyes were full of vigor. When his father came back, he would let his father know that he was capable enough to protect the entire Wu family. With Wu Suijun, the pillar of the family, going to the border, the prosperous Wu family was completely silent. Although Wu Suijun was still a senior official of the third level, everyone could see that Dongfang Xiao wanted to suppress him in the court that day. Therefore, he didn't dare to have any contact with the Wu family. The siblings of the Wu family, who used to be arrogant outside, also disappeared, which made people sigh. Dozens of miles along the official road in the east of Yunjing City, there was an osmanthus forest. At this moment, the osmanthus flowers were just in full bloom, but Su Li could still smell the faint fragrance of osmanthus from a distance. The carriage drove down the official road and went deep along the path in the osmanthus forest. A huge yard gradually came into view without the cover of the woods. Arriving here, Su Li found that Dongfang Rui beside her didn't say a word. Squeak, the carriage stopped in front of the gate of the yard. Wu Bin jumped off the carriage and immediately took down the wooden ladder on the side of the carriage board. Then he lifted the curtain and said, "Master, Miss, here we are." After the incident of the Wu family, Dongfang Rui once again asked Su Li to recognize her ancestors and return to the family. Su Li only replied one sentence, which made Dongfang Rui speechless. "My surname is Su." But this time, Su Li didn't resist Wu Bin's address. Wu Bin was a little happy when he heard that. He quickly signaled Dongfang Rui with his eyes. Dongfang Rui came back from the long memory. He hesitated and said, "Li, go in and have a look. This is the yard I built for your mother." Su Li glanced at Wu Bin and then silently pushed the door open and walked in. Wu Bin was excited at once. He whispered to Dongfang Rui, "Master, you see, Miss has gradually accepted you now. You should be happy." Dongfang Rui nodded. Dongfang Rui was slightly refreshed, but he smiled bitterly. For more than a decade, he had never been to the yard. There were too many memories between him and Yun. Only Su Li's appearance made him pluck up the courage to step in again. When she pushed the door open, the smell of camphor fragrant wood came to her face, which calmed her slightly fluctuating state of mind. The courtyard wasn't very big, but the layout was ingenious and unique. This place was different from Prince Rui's residence as it was filled with the gentleness of a woman, which made her feel very comfortable. It was designed by Niang. Her palm stroked the rockery and grass as she walked along the winding path. Her expression became even more calm, and the evil aura that remained in her heart from the slaughter of a few nights ago had completely vanished at this moment. It was obvious that someone had specially cleaned this place. Not a speck of dust could be seen, yet the courtyard's original appearance was maintained. The person who cleaned the courtyard was very attentive. With this thought in mind, Su Li gently pushed open the door of the room. A cold breath came in. The furniture in the room was of the style of more than 10 years ago, but they were all wiped clean as new. She touched the desk and sat down gently. Didn't Mother also sit here every night and study diligently every day? Suddenly, Su Li saw the clothes folded beside the pillow on the bed. She got up and walked over, picking them up and unfolding them. It was a silk dress for babies. Mother probably didn't know that she was pregnant at that time, but had already prepared the clothes and looked forward to her arrival. Su Li held the silk dress and fell into a daze. In her mind, a woman with a vague face sat on the edge of the bed, folding the clothes and looking forward to it. Unknowingly, tears rolled down her cheeks and dripped onto her clothes. It turned out that her existence had been so carefully held in the heart of this woman and cared for and yearned for. Mother, Su Li tried to speak, and her hoarse voice echoed in the cold room, as if someone was responding. Miss, the incense and candles are ready. Suddenly, Wu Bin's voice came from outside the door. Su Li came to her sense, dried her tears and went out. This place was the courtyard built by her father for her mother, and now it was also the location of her mother's grave. Following Wu Bin to go up the mountain from the back of the courtyard, Su Li saw a low slope and the lonely figure of Dongfang Rui on an extremely open hilltop. Su Li narrowed her eyes and walked to the grave. She saw the words on the tombstone. The tomb of the deceased wife, Su Yun. She wrote, established by her husband, Dongfang Rui. It was a very simple tombstone. There was no epitaph to record Su Yun's life, and there was no special stone tablet. Your mother likes to be simple. If I make it complicated, she will definitely blame me. Dongfang Rui took a deep breath and pretended to be relaxed. He sighed and said, I wanted to let your mother enter the imperial mausoleum, but the Empress Dowager was still alive at that time. I couldn't resist, so I could only bury your mother here. Later, when I thought about it, maybe it was your mother's intention. The tomb of the Dongfang family was a little dirty for her. Su Li looked back at Wu Bin, who stood far away and didn't intend to come over. She couldn't help but sigh. She took the incense and candles and lit them. She walked a few steps forward and knelt down without hesitation. She inserted the burning incense into the soft soil and cleaned the dust on the tombstone with one hand. In front of me, you don't have to pretend to be strong. Hearing his daughter's plain words, Dongfang Rui's eyes were wet at once. His tone was slightly trembling. Your mother will definitely say that you are weak again. Forget it. When he came here every year, he couldn't help but cry like a dog. This time was not a big deal. Dongfang Rui took a deep breath and took the wrapped head. He uncovered the white cloth and put it in front of the tombstone. He was happy and said, Yun, I did it. I found my daughter. The enemy has been beheaded. You can rest in peace in heaven. The wind caressed his face like a soft sigh, whispering in his ear. Su Li tidied up the weeds on the edge of the tomb. She straightened up and looked down the mountain. The Osmanthus forest was full of beautiful scenery. She suddenly felt relaxed. At least when her mother was alive, she had a very happy time. There was a man who loved her deeply. Her mother didn't live in vain. Now she saw her father and herself together. She would be very happy in another world. After a long silence, Su Li turned around and said, Lord Rui, let me stay with my mother for a while. Dongfang Rui was disappointed when he heard that. But he still said with concern, it's late. I will wait for you at the foot of the mountain for 2 hours. Talk to your mother. Okay. Seeing that Dongfang Rui turned around and left, the proprietress hiding in the grass was about to follow him immediately. But she was stopped by Xian Jingju, who transmitted the sound immediately. Now that things have come to this, you still refuse to come to your senses. Even if you don't care about what Dongfang Rui did, what about Yun? If you kill him, will Yun be happy? What should Li do? The proprietress was slightly shocked. She felt extremely complicated and blamed herself. After a long time, she suddenly loosened her grip as if she had lost all her strength. Then she walked down the mountain. Let's go. I don't have the face to see Li. She had always been very clear in her heart that if she had been able to rush over a little faster that year, Yuna might not have died. After Dongfang Rui left, there was only Su Li and a head beside the tombstone. Su Li gently stroked the tombstone, as if she was stroking her mother's cheek. Mother, I always know that he doesn't owe you anything. He hasn't married in these years and has been looking for me in the world. But how can I call him dad? She still remembered that she poisoned Dongfang Rui in the previous life. She watched the man fall down and spit out black blood. She was happy and ferocious. Then Su Zipei appeared quietly and told the truth. Dongfang Rui died with everlasting regret. The disbelief and remorse in his eyes never disappeared in her mind. How could such a terrible sin be completely forgotten just because he wanted to start all over again? You and I are so sinful that we can only die tragically. I will wait for you in the underground, ha ha ha. Yi Tian's words before her death suddenly came to her ears. Su Li's eyes were filled with tears. She sat beside the tombstone and slowly held her arms. At this moment, she was no longer a wise woman who could devise strategies, nor was she the calm Ms. Li who controlled all the situations. She was just a 16-year-old girl who had no one to talk about her guilt. The mountain wind blew and made the white cloth of the head rustle. Finally, the head fell to one side and rolled to Su Li's feet. Su Li raised her head and stared at the head for a long time. Suddenly, she frowned slightly and noticed the abnormality. Then the golden light condensed in her eyes. In Su Li's eyes, Wu Lirong's face suddenly melted and twisted for a few seconds. Then, it turned into another face. She was not Wu Lirong. Su Li's expression turned cold instantly. Her anger triggered her cultivation. Her black hair danced wildly in the wind and forest. In a rage, she smashed the head with one palm. Blood rained all over the sky. Wu Lirong was not dead yet. She stood up slowly. At this moment, she was furious but extremely calm. She could still maintain her disguise after death. Even she couldn't see the clue. Such a brilliant disguise skill was not like something in the martial arts circle at all. Instead, it was like the spiritual circle. Did Wu Lirong have something to do with the spiritual circle? An hour later, half of the sky was dyed with red clouds. Su Li came down from the mountain. Dongfang Rui quickly took a thick cloak and put it on Su Li. He said, "Butler Wu just said that it was windy on the mountain. Wear more clothes in case of catching a cold." Su Li nodded slightly and stepped into the carriage. She didn't tell Dongfang Rui about Wu Lirong. In order to avenge her mother, she had made Dongfang Xiao unhappy and the Wu family regarded her as an enemy. It was inappropriate for her to act rashly in a short time. She could handle the rest by herself. Seeing that Su Li obediently got on the carriage with a gentler attitude than before, Dongfang Rui grinned contentedly and followed her to get on the carriage. At the same time, in an ordinary house in Yunjing City, Wu Lirong cautiously pushed open the door and walked in. There was only a small oil lamp in the dim room. The shadow under the flickering light looked extremely terrible. Wu Lirong saw the enlarged shadow under the light and immediately breathed a sigh of relief. She turned around and closed the door. But at this moment, a cold voice sounded faintly, "Wu Lirong, I took the risk of being exposed to let you escape. Should you fulfill your promise and help me find the whereabouts of Ning Qing?" At this moment, Wu Lirong had goosebumps on her back. It seemed that she was stared at by a poisonous snake in the dark and would die in the next moment. There was a layer of cold sweat on her forehead. She slowly turned around and smiled apologetically. "Senior, you must be joking. You also know that I am in a bad situation now. How can I casually send someone to inquire about the news? Why don't you wait for a few more days? After this period of time, when the limelight is over." Whoosh! A 3-foot-long sword flew over Wu Lirong's neck at a lightning speed and nailed to the wooden door behind her. It buzzed. Ah ah ah. Wu Lirong was so scared that her face turned pale. She covered her neck and screamed. Suddenly, another thing flew over and blocked her mouth. It was a steamed bun. Chapter 203. Wu Lirong immediately covered her mouth. She found that her neck was not cut, but a red mark left by the sword. She felt a burning pain. He controlled his strength so precisely. His cultivation was beyond her imagination. However, although this person's cultivation was high, he had been hiding from place to place. After a few months, he changed more than a dozen places of residence. It seemed that he was being chased by more horrible people. The man seemed to have recognized Wu Lirong's identity. He asked her to help him find a woman named Ning Qing. In return, he would do something for her. At that time, she wanted to sound him out, so she asked him to find a scapegoat for her. After all, she had offended many people these years. She didn't want to be killed inexplicably on the street one day. Unexpectedly, the man asked her to find a mammy with a similar figure without hesitation. Then he used some tricks to make the mammy look like her. At that time, she immediately knew that she had encountered a treasure. On the night when Dongfang Rui killed her, she happened to go out and didn't return. So, she asked a substitute to take her place at home. Unexpectedly, she escaped a fatal disaster. When she came back, her brother Wu Suijun had been sent to the frontier. She didn't know what her brother was thinking. So, she didn't dare to go to the Wu family. After thinking about it, she could only find this man. My patience is limited. If you can't help me, I will take your life back and find someone else to help me. You have to think about it. The man's voice came from the darkness. Wu Lirong trembled. There was some fear on her charming face. But soon the fear was suppressed by the surging jealousy and hatred. Master, help me with one more thing. After it's done, I will immediately use all the resources in my hands to help you find that woman. I know that you are also in a difficult situation. If you look for someone else, how can you guarantee that that person will help you keep your secret like I did? Am I right? The man in the darkness fell into silence. After a long time, he said, Do you want to die? Wu Lirong stepped back and leaned against the door. Then she saw the sword still nailed to the door. She swallowed and said, I don't want to die. But if I can't do it, I won't die in peace. Please help me. After it is done, I will repay you even if I have to work like a cow or a horse. Ha ha ha, the man let out a low laugh. Remember what you said today. I don't care if you work for me, as long as we find Ning Qing, you'd better get lost immediately. Wu Lirong's breathing stagnated, and her face darkened. This person and Dongfang Rui were the same. Why wouldn't he like her? What was so bad about her? Why did everyone like Su Yun and wanted to marry her? Why did she end up as a son-in-law who coveted fame and fortune? While his heart was in turmoil, the person in the dark said impatiently, What are you waiting for? If you don't want to talk, then scram. Wu Lirong came back to her senses and hurriedly said, Please help me kill someone. A silver line flashed across the man's eyes under the black robe. Who is it? What's his cultivation? Don't worry about this, Master. To Master, killing her is as easy as blowing off dust. Wu Lirong smiled sinisterly and said, Her name is Su Li. She usually lives in the affiliated school of the National Academy. Her cultivation is only in the acquired 8th hurdle. The man nodded and said, This woman seems to be very famous, but it has nothing to do with me. You will get the news within 3 days. Remember what you said. Wu Lirong was overjoyed when she heard that. She quickly saluted and thanked him. Then she turned around. Her eyes were full of hatred. Dongfang Rui, since you don't want to marry me, I will let you live in pain for the rest of your life. If Su Yun died, Su Li wouldn't live either. In the evening, after the class in the National Academy, a tall and thin middle-aged scholar walked to the gate of the National Academy with a book in his hand. The guard at the gate immediately smiled and greeted him, Mr. Dao, long time no see. Are you going to the third prince's mansion again? The middle-aged scholar who was called Mr. Dao nodded kindly and said, Yes, the third prince has been busy with his studies recently. I am worried about him. The guard immediately respected him and said, Thank you for your hard work, Mr. Dao. Take care. Watching the carriage go away, the old guard shook his head and sighed. Nowadays, there are not many scholars as dedicated as Mr. Dao. Yes. In the carriage, the middle-aged scholar lifted the sleeve covering his right hand and glanced at the wound where a large piece of flesh was cut off and the bone was exposed. Then he covered it again and looked at the traffic outside the window. He was gloomy. Mr. Dao, we have arrived at the third prince's mansion. A voice came from outside the carriage. The middle-aged scholar immediately got off and walked briskly. There was a manservant waiting at the gate. Seeing him coming, the manservant immediately went to help him take the book. The third lord has been waiting for you. The middle-aged scholar sighed deeply and said gratefully, Thank you, Your Highness. It doesn't matter. Mr. Dao, please come with me. The manservant smiled and led the middle-aged scholar in. As soon as he stepped into the room, he saw Dongfang Lang coming and asking with concern, Mr. Zisang, I heard that your people. Are you okay? I specially prepared a doctor for you. Dao Zisang looked ashamed. He lifted the wound on his arm and bowed his head. This time, I miscalculated. I didn't expect that the people of the Hehuan sect had already found out our position and refined a large number of illusionary powder. Although I controlled the puppet to avoid the hidden weapons, the illusionary powder blended into the rain. I was hit accidentally. It turned out that Dao Zisang, the teacher of the third prince and the lecturer of the National Academy, was the leader of the black-shirted man who led the Lianxia cult to get a share of the night attack. He had another identity. He was the elder of the Lianxia cult. For the great event of the Lianxia cult, he had changed his appearance and lived in Yunjing City for 19 years. Then 13 years ago, he finally found an opportunity to become the teacher of the third prince and assist him to become a talent. It could be said that all the talents and wisdom that Dongfang Lang had now were taught by him. When Dongfang Lang saw the wound on Dao Zisang's hand, he was shocked and quickly arranged a doctor to treat Dao Zisang. The illusionary powder of the Hehuan sect. Does it mean that the eldest brother's people have already known our arrangement? Dongfang Lang frowned and said, the Hehuan sect is now wanted by the whole country. How dare they be so arrogant? Dao Zisang shook his head and said, it is not the original people of the Hehuan sect who are arrogant, but the new elder. I heard from the spy that the Hehuan sect sent reinforcements for the auction fair. It seems that I have to ask for help from the sect. He had no choice but to ask for help. Dao Zisang didn't tell the third prince how heavy the loss of his men was. Only he himself knew that all the people he brought with him that night were dead. Even the corpse puppets were gone. He didn't know how he survived that inexplicably. Perhaps the person who killed him was negligent and thought that he was dead. However, he would not mention such a shameful thing to anyone. The people of the Hehuan sect were too powerful, so he failed. We should have listened to Ling Qinglan and stayed still. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such a big loss. Dongfang Lang couldn't help but sigh. Dao Zisang moved his lips and finally didn't refute. Although he always disliked Ling Qinglan and always felt that he was a little weird, he really couldn't find a reason to refute this time. The eldest brother should be very happy now, right? Dongfang Lang stood up and snorted, Teacher, I will make you pay for your injury sooner or later. The first prince, Dongfang Sheng, was not very happy. Now he was very angry. Elder Dao, how can you be so reckless? You barged into the Wu family without telling me in advance and caused such a ruckus. How am I supposed to compete with third brother and fifth brother in the future? First prince. Elder Dao covered his right shoulder which was oozing with blood and roared, do you forget that you took the initiative to seek cooperation with the Hehuan sect? I am not your subordinate. You. Dongfang Sheng stared at him. How could this person be so rude? Chu Lu was respectful to him on the surface. Was this Elder Dao even unwilling to be polite on the surface? It seemed that Elder Dao realized that his tone was inappropriate. He took a breath and said slowly, the matter of the Wu family is my responsibility. I will report to the hierarch and send more people to help Your Highness. Your Highness, don't worry. I will go back to recuperate. Goodbye. Then Elder Dao got up and left. He could fight and kill in the martial arts circle. But when he came to Yunjing City where he had to make a lot of turns, he was really not used to it. How about giving the branch in Yunjing City to Chu Lu? Elder Dao, who had a bad start, felt a deep sense of dejection in his heart. Not only did he lose all his subordinates, but his relationship with the first prince was also very strained because of him. If he returned like this, would he be thrown directly into the 1,000 poison cave by the sect leader? Elder Dao couldn't help but shiver. He had to think about how to report to the hierarch. Ha 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 ha, after Dongfang Yang saw the news of the 2 mansions sent by Ma Jintian, he couldn't help but laugh and said, my 2 brothers are really stubborn. After this matter, don't they know father's mind? Even if they do it well, father will not like them with the help of evil method. Ma Jintian nodded with a smile and didn't forget to flatter, the 5th prince is wise. After this matter, the emperor will definitely treat you differently. You can be the crown prince. Hearing this, Dongfang Yang laughed more cheerfully. He didn't have many outstanding achievements, but fortunately, he had 2 stupid brothers as his comparison. In this case, He must be the only one his father could choose. In the cold hall, Dongfang Wuxue sat on the wooden horse and stared at the door blankly. After a while, a middle-aged mammy came and said softly, "Your Highness, it's time to go. You should have a rest." Dongfang Wuxue pouted and said, "I won't go. I want to wait for father and mother." The middle-aged mammy still smiled and said, "Your Highness, you are growing up. If you don't sleep, you will become shorter. Father and mother will not like it." Dongfang Wuxue stood up aggrievedly and took the middle-aged mammy's hand to walk to the bedchamber. He said, "If I sleep, father and mother will come, right?" "Yes, Your Highness. But you said it yesterday. Are you lying to me?" After a while, Dongfang Wuxue fell asleep and breathed evenly. The middle-aged mammy touched his forehead with a face full of pity. "Your mother annoyed the empress and has been banished to the cold palace by the emperor. Your father has many children. How can he come to see you? Your Highness, you are destined to grow up with loneliness." At the same time, the Linli building in Qinghe County just finished a busy day and closed the door. Mai Ruohan was busy settling the accounts. Luo Ichen and Fang Mu went to the secluded place. Only she and Fang Ling were here tonight. "Ruohan, I'm going to rest. It's late. You should rest early." "Well, I'll come after I finish these accounts." Mai Ruohan nodded and smiled. Today was the day when the disciples of the Linli building who trained in the secluded place finished their practice. After today, there would be a large number of loyal disciples in the Linli building. She and Haydn could have a good rest and practice. Su Li didn't allow her to tell the truth about the Linli building. But later she pestered Luo Ichen to ask. Luo Ichen finally couldn't bear her pestering and told her all the facts. Mai Ruohan's choice was unexpectedly decisive. She chose to stay in the Linli building. Perhaps she had a heart that yearned for a more thrilling and exciting life. Mai Ruohan thought so. Luo Ichen's figure flashed in her mind, and she smiled sweetly. Chapter 204. Ah! A cry of pain came from the lobby. Ruohan, Fang Ling, Haydn, and others immediately rushed from the back room to the central room. But when they saw Mai Ruohan's situation, they all breathed a sigh of relief. Mai Ruohan pulled out the barb on her wrist and smiled embarrassedly. "There is a wooden barb on the counter. I was careless. Sorry to scare you." "It doesn't matter." Haydn scratched his head and said with a smile, "I will ask someone to fix it tomorrow morning. Then, it will be smooth and covered with a cloth." "You're too careless. Your wrist is bleeding. Wait for me. I will get the medicine box for you." Fang Ling checked the wound on Mai Ruohan's hand and then ran back to the inner room. When everyone left, Mai Ruohan felt warm in her heart. Everyone in the Linli building was like her family and cared about her very much. "Well, why is my wrist hot?" Mai Ruohan looked down and pinched her left wrist. She frowned. It was just a small wooden thorn, and it had been pulled out. It should not have such a big reaction. As her wrist became hotter and hotter, Mai Ruohan suddenly panicked. She pinched her wrist with her hand, as if it could make her feel more comfortable. At this moment, there was a soft sound. An orange halo like a bracelet suddenly appeared on her smooth wrist. It was exuding a gentle heat, which made Mai Ruohan feel very warm. "What is this? Why do I have this thing on me?" Mai Ruohan curiously reached out to touch it, but her fingers passed through the halo and couldn't touch it at all. The orange halo only lasted for half a breath, and then it faded away. No matter how Mai Ruohan pressed it, it would not appear again. Strange, Mai Ruohan tilted her head and was puzzled. She yawned and suddenly felt very sleepy. She couldn't open her eyes. "Forget it. Let's do the account tomorrow." Mai Ruohan staggered to the room and slept soundly without taking off her clothes. Fang Ling found her with the medicine box and smiled helplessly. "Sister Mai is really tired these days." In the next few days, Mai Ruohan was a little absent-minded. She always made mistakes in the account. From time to time, she would be in a daze for a long time, which made Haydn and others worried. They wanted to ask a doctor for Mai Ruohan. Fortunately, Mai Ruohan finally recovered when Luo Ichen came back with others. "Brother Luo, you're finally back." Before Luo Ichen entered the door, He was hugged by her. The cold smile on his face immediately turned soft. He comforted her softly, "Let's go in first." The disciples of the Linli building, who had just emerged from the secluded site, were all confused. So Protector Chen knew how to smile. "Go in. I just let you become the official disciples of the Linli building. Do you learn to be in a daze and be lazy?" Fang Mu's cold voice sounded behind him. After being an instructor in the secluded site for half a year, his temperament seemed to have changed a little. Hearing that, everyone immediately reacted and entered the Linli building in an orderly manner. Early in the morning, old Li, who had drunk so much that his eyes were blurry, came over with a wine pot in his arms. He stammered, "Who are these people? Killing intent is soaring." Fang Mu's face immediately returned to a bright and warm smile. He smiled warmly and said, "Sir, they are all new waiters of the winery." "Waiter? Oh, I see." Laro Li held the flagon and walked away. Fang Mu's face instantly became cold again. He looked at the newcomers who were shocked and shouted coldly, "Go in." "Yes, yes." The newcomers couldn't help but criticize in their hearts. It turned out that Protector Chen and Protector Mu were normal people. Then they still arranged so many terrible training tasks for them in the secluded site. In the underground adytum, 20 newcomers lined up in a row. All of them were in the acquired 9th hurdle. It only took half a year. With the support of Su Li's secret medicine, these ordinary people, who obviously didn't have much aptitude, all became seniors in the acquired 9th hurdle. Fang Ling put her hands on her hips and looked at a group of uneasy newcomers in the room. She walked to Fang Mu and pulled his sleeves to complain, "There are only 20 people. My sister is in Yunjing. It is definitely not enough." The newcomers were still guessing Fang Ling's identity. When they suddenly heard Fang Ling say Yunjing, they were all shocked. But soon they concealed the shock and continued to maintain a calm appearance. Fang Mu helplessly touched Fang Ling's eyebrows and transmitted the sound in silence. "Of course, there are more than 20 people who have been trained. But only these 20 people are barely competent and have been strictly selected for their loyalty." Fang Ling suddenly understood. Luo Chen also nodded and said, "The quality is more than the number of people going to Yunjing. So many people are enough. It is not easy to arrange more people. Ruohan, how about contacting people in Yunjing?" My Ruohan nodded quickly and said, "Yes. Sister Xuetong said that we can go there. Tianbao Pharmacy is short of manpower to transport a large number of medicinal materials to Yunjing. They will set off in 3 days." Luo Chen's eyes flashed. He turned back and said in a deep voice, "This is your last test. Within 3 days, you must mix into the transportation team of Tianbao Pharmacy by any means." "Yes, Protector Chen," everyone said in unison, and their eyes were burning. After half a year in that remote place, they finally had a chance to show their talent. If someone can't get in, it means that you are not capable enough. You will not even have the chance to see Mr. Li. Go back to the secluded site and continue to practice. Do you hear me? Yes. For a moment, the shouting became louder. My Ruohan covered her mouth and chuckled. These guys were in high morale purely because they were afraid to go back to the secluded site. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain in her wrist. A familiar scene flashed through her mind. It seemed that she had experienced the same thing a long time ago. Ruohan? Hearing someone calling her, my Ruohan came to her sense. She immediately saw a pair of eyes full of concern. It was Brother Luo. She blushed and turned her head. "I'm fine, Brother Luo. I just thought of something." My Ruohan smiled sweetly. Why did she think so much? Even if there was such a thing as the previous life, she didn't need it. Brother Luo was enough. So, 3 days later, 20 newcomers of the Linli building became temporary workers of Tianbao Pharmacy without exception. Fang Mu also went with them. After all, these people were elites that had been carefully selected from hundreds of people. If there were any mountain rocks along the way, it would be a huge waste. It should be known that the amount of money spent on 20 people in the past 6 months was more than what he had spent. Luo Chen was unwilling to go to Yunjing because of my Ruohan. Haydn had reached the acquired 9th hurdle for a long time, But he hadn't found the opportunity to break through. He couldn't go out. Only he could come out. Fang Mu curled his lips. It was a long journey. It was not easy to be a babysitter. Fortunately, he could see his eldest brother after arriving in Yunjing. Fang Mu's eyes flashed with excitement. After practicing AO sword skills, he also realized the opportunity to break through and successfully broke through to the inborn first hurdle. This time, he must let his eldest brother see that he didn't lose the face of the Fang family and didn't let Miss Su down. Half a month later, the team of Tianbao Pharmacy arrived at the gate of Yunjing. Tianbao Pharmacy was an old industry in Yunjing. Nothing had happened. The gate inspection passed safely. Fang Mu, dressed in coarse linen clothes and dressed like a manservant, pushed the handcart into the city. He only felt a pain in the ass. If he could do it again, he would definitely ask Luo Chen to come out and have a taste. He ate dry food on the way and almost tasted bland. However, those guys were full of enthusiasm and expectation. They were not defeated by the boredom of the half-month. The handcart of the Tianbao Pharmacy arrived at the back door. The supervisor dismissed the staff. The 20 guys immediately left and then gathered in the alley not far from the Tianbao Pharmacy. Fang Mu came last. He glanced at the newcomers who gathered and quieted down. He looked around and suddenly smiled to the air. "Brother Qingning, I am here. You can't avoid me, can you? When did you surpass me in cultivation?" Chu Qingning, who was hiding in the alley, suddenly appeared, which shocked everyone. When did a person hide there? They had clearly checked it just now and didn't find anything. Fang Mu didn't see his old friend for a long time, so he was slightly excited. He hammered Chu Qingning's fist and said with a smile, "I didn't surpass you. You are the only one who steals wine in the restaurant." Chu Qingning couldn't help but smell it. He immediately scolded with a smile, "You really have a dog's nose. Let's go. We can't stay here for a long time. Let's go back first. When these guys come, I can dismiss the temporary waiters. Ordinary people are really restricted. They even need to be on guard to open an underground additum." On the way, Chu Qingning came to the 2 carriages with others and smiled. In order not to attract attention, he had already prepared. One day later, the Linli building in Yunjing City was brand new. The waiters kept shouting at the door. Since the opening of the Linli building, there were many repeat customers. Finally, the business was booming. Xian Jingju saw it, but he frowned. He was worried about a lot of things. The business of Juyu Winery was getting worse and worse. How could he live in the future? He hadn't drunk the Liehua spirits for a long time. Chen Gong didn't come, and he had no money to buy the spirits. Damn it. On the first day, he saw that all the new waiters were in the acquired 9th hurdle. On the second day, they all became ordinary people. He was not blind. Moreover, he thought that Ling Qinglan also came here before. The Linli building was obviously an invisible sect. He and his wife were cheated. Besides, they drank their spirits and owed them a favor. Xian Jingju was in a cold sweat. Could it be that he and his wife were set up? The more he thought, the more suspicious he was. He didn't study these days. He stared at the Linli building, hoping to find something. At this moment, in the affiliated school of the National Academy, Su Li was quietly reading the AO sword skills in the study. This sword skills had been in her hands for a long time, but she didn't expect that the successor of Jin Cheng AO in the previous life, Marquis Sword, rose suddenly. Although she had a little talent in swordsmanship, she seemed to be a little worse than Marquis Sword. However, after several months of study, she finally understood the 4th hurdle of the AO sword skills. When she mastered the true meaning of the 4th hurdle, she even dared to fight against the senior of the longevity realm who was beyond the inborn hurdle. Suddenly, Su Li frowned, and a sense of danger came from all directions. Although it was an intuition, the experience of fighting outside all year round in the previous life told her that someone wanted to kill her, and it was a senior. However, why didn't he do it? There was no one here, only the elite soldiers of the Lord Rui's mansion guarding outside the house. Could it be that he didn't dare? He was a senior above the inborn 7th hurdle, but he was so cautious. Su Li lowered her head, and her eyes flashed. She immediately got up and opened the door. Then the sense of danger disappeared completely. Sure enough. Su Li sneered in her heart, but she ordered on the surface, "Mammy Li, get ready. I want to go out for a walk." The man in the dark heard the words, and his eyes flashed with killing intent. Chapter 205. Miss, is it really okay for you to go out without anyone? Mammy Li asked worriedly. It's not safe in the city recently. Su Li smiled and said, "Don't worry, Mammy. It's daytime now. Don't those terrible things happen at night? I'm just going to the downtown. Nothing will happen." The man in the dark smiled slightly. She was so naive and pitiful. The carriage of the Lord Rui's mansion sent Su Li to the downtown street, and then Su Li got off. She really wandered in the downtown. She looked around as she walked, and touched all kinds of jewelry, but she didn't buy anything. It seemed that the style was not beautiful enough. The man took the bamboo hat and followed Su Li without a trace. He picked up the jewelry that Su Li had touched and looked at it. Finally, he hesitated for a moment and bought a hairpin that he thought was beautiful. Women were really troublesome. By the way, I heard that there is a new jewelry store on the next street. Let's go and have a look. But there is no one on that street. Will there be any danger? Su Li said to herself. Sometimes she hesitated and finally smiled. It should be okay to have a look. Then, Su Li walked cheerfully to the alley on the left where there was no one. When the man saw it, he immediately showed a ferocious killing intent and followed her into the alley without hesitation. Seeing Su Li walking not far in front of him, he quickly approached her without a sound. At the same time, a 3-foot-long sword appeared under his wide robe and stabbed at Su Li fiercely. Crack! The sound was wrong. The moment he heard the sword stabbing into her, the man's face changed instantly. He retreated into the downtown without saying a word. But at this moment, there was a slight sound of breaking the air behind him. When? The man in the bamboo hat was slightly shocked, but he was as calm as ice. He forcibly turned around and confronted Su Li. Ding! A huge and terrible force attacked along the tip of the sword. The long sword broke inch by inch and couldn't be used in the blink of an eye. It was a precious sword in the man's hand. Su Li's face slightly froze. She let go of the force and took a few steps back. She stamped her feet and rushed to the man empty-handed without saying a word. Stupid! The man in the bamboo hat sneered. She dared to rush over without a weapon. She was courting death. The cyan sword in his hand was aimed at Su Li's heart without hesitation. His feet flashed and he was about to take Su Li's life. At this moment, the bamboo-hatted man's expression suddenly changed. He stopped his attack and frantically retreated. He clutched his chest, the numbness spreading from his chest to the rest of his body. He was poisoned. When did this happen? Suddenly, he thought of something and took out a hairpin with trembling hands. So that was it. Su Li chuckled. You dare to pick up the things that I have touched one by one. I really admire you. Don't worry, this poison won't kill you. It will only make you unable to move for 4 hours, and you will recover after a day and a night. But, speaking of this, Su Li's eyes flashed. In my opinion, you are probably a practitioner of the longevity realm, right? Furthermore, I'm heavily injured. Otherwise, I would have been heavily injured from that exchange just now. After saying that, Su Li reached out and wiped the bloody wound on her right hand. A green light flashed, and the wound quickly scabbed and fell off. Seeing this scene, the bamboo-hatted man's pupils shrank slightly. He raised his sword and faced it from a distance, and then hung it down weakly. His voice was low and hoarse. Who are you? At this moment, he couldn't wait to go back and kill Wu Lirong first. What an ordinary woman of acquired 8th hurdle who only knew some simple healing methods. She was clearly a horrible female practitioner who mastered the power of Jupiter in the spiritual circle, and her cultivation was not much worse than his. Now he was seriously injured and couldn't even exert 10% of his strength. It was simply a fat meat that came to his door. She also mastered a variety of poison skills and didn't follow the gentleman's way in battle. Even when he was still in the sect, he didn't want to face such a horrible opponent at all. But he was unlucky to meet her in the secular world. Step, 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 Su Li walked toward him. The bamboo-hatted man wanted to move, but he was paralyzed and couldn't even speak. He could only watch Su Li approaching. Su Li picked up the man's right arm with one hand and lifted it 1 inch from the ground. Then she walked along the alley. "You won't kill me?" The bamboo-hatted man transmitted the sound with difficulty. Su Li smiled slightly and took the jade hairpin from his hand. "I am suddenly interested in you. Can't I?" Originally, Su Li always tortured and interrogated those who came to kill her first, and then killed them. But this man was a senior of the longevity realm from the spiritual circle. Besides, he was a man, and he just bought the jade hairpin. It was obvious that he was thinking about another woman. Would a practitioner of the longevity realm do the killer's business? For all these reasons, Su Li suddenly had a strong interest in this man. Maybe after sorting out her thoughts, she could let her Leanly building have another free fighter of the longevity sword. Why not? Not long after, Su Li came to the back door of the Leanly building with the bamboo-hatted man, who was confused. It was Chu Qingning who opened the door. Seeing that Su Li came here with this appearance and there was an outsider beside her, he was also confused. Then, Xian Jingju, who had been secretly observing next door, opened his eyes wide in surprise. "Why did Su Li come here?" "Su Li, what are you?" Before Chu Qingning finished his words, Su Li noticed that someone was spying on them. Without saying anything, she took the man in the bamboo hat and came in. Chu Qingning found that the man in the bamboo hat could not move and was held by Su Li all the way. Fang Yuan and others followed her to the top floor and looked at each other. They didn't know where Su Li brought a man here, just like Luochen before. But this time, the man's condition was much better than that of Luochen, who was covered with blood. Su Li took a cyan porcelain bottle from the table and put some water on the man's lips. It didn't take long for the man to feel that his mouth could move, but the other parts of his face were still numb and uncontrollable. The bamboo-hatted man was lifted, and Su Li saw the man's face clearly. It was very ordinary. She used the eye skill, but she couldn't see any clue. Was he the one who had done it? Su Li frowned and had a guess in her heart. The man's eyes were stimulated by the sudden bright light and burst into tears. At the same time, he also saw the scene in the room, which shocked him greatly. There were 3 young masters gathered here. Including Su Li, there were 4 young masters. The number of young masters was not less than that of his original sect. Young masters were also extremely precious in the spiritual circle. Those who could communicate with the heaven and earth and become inborn before the age of 20 were all gifted talents. In the future, they might even reach the legendary realm. Therefore, every supreme youth was a seed that was carefully protected in the true spirit sector. But now, he actually saw a number of young masters, who were enough to cause a big fight in the spiritual circle, gathered quietly in an inconspicuous winery in the secular world. Even with his well-informed vision, he couldn't help but be stunned. Su Li had been to the spiritual circle. Of course, she knew why the man was shocked. She was more vigilant. The AO sword skills must not be exposed. Otherwise, under the struggle of several major forces in the spiritual circle, the force she had just established would be destroyed. Thinking of this, Su Li teasingly said with a smile, "Killer, don't you want to say something?" "Killer?" The expressions of Fang Yuan and others changed slightly. This person was the killer who attacked Su Li. Why did Su Li bring this person to the Leanly building? The man snorted coldly. He turned his head and said stubbornly, "Since I am in your hands, you can do whatever you want to me." "Oh." Su Li slightly raised her eyebrows. She turned her palm and took out the jade hairpin. She squinted and smiled. "What about the future owner of this thing?" The man's eyes changed a few times in an instant. Finally, his expression dimmed and he fell into a long silence. Then, no matter how Su Li asked and how she goaded him, the man kept silent all the time. He seemed to be stubborn and eager to die. Su Li twisted her eyebrows and asked Chu Qingning and Fang Mu to take him to take a bath first. She didn't know how long this man hadn't changed his clothes. He smelled like a beggar. Obviously, he was a practitioner of the longevity realm, but he didn't care about it at all. "Why should I help him to take a bath?" Chu Qingning stared at her. He didn't like to help a man to take a bath. Fang Mu was also speechless. He had just arrived in Yunjing for a short time. Why were the errands so unsuitable? Su Li tilted her head and said, "Among the 4 people here, only you and Fang Mu have the lowest cultivation. Do you have any opinion? Are you willing to let Yin Shuetong?" Thinking that Yin Shuetong would help other men to take a bath, Chu Qingning suddenly got goosebumps. Without saying anything, he carried the man and ran to the bathhouse. Fang Mu looked at him and laughed. Brother Qingning was still as funny as before. "Mu, you go with him." Su Li handed over a white porcelain bottle and said, "Poison the man every half an hour. Don't be careless." Fang Mu scratched his head and took it carefully. He was afraid that he would also be infected with the paralyzing poison. He thought for a while and couldn't help but ask, "Sister Su Li, the poison you refined can paralyze for 4 hours. Why do you have to be so careful?" Su Li shook her head and her eyes were full of deep meaning. "That person is different." Fang Yuan was surprised when he heard Su Li's words. Different? How could he be different? Su Li said that no one could survive this poison, whether inborn or acquired. Could it be, he is in the longevity realm? Su Li didn't hide it. As soon as she said that, the faces of the 2 people present changed. Fang Mu grasped the white porcelain bottle and immediately ran to the bathhouse. Half an hour? No. He would poison the man every quarter of an hour. Facing such a horrible enemy as the longevity realm, no matter how careful he was. The bathhouse had been boiling water all the time. Chu Qingning was angry. When he arrived at the bathhouse, he rolled up his sleeves and directly threw the man who couldn't move into the boiling water. Anyway, the inborn senior couldn't be burned to death. Su Li took it for granted. What did she mean by the lowest cultivation? It really pissed him off. Seeing the man who was still bubbling in the water, Chu Qingning showed a perverted smile. He ran into the bathtub, picked up the man, and said with an evil smile in his ear, "Motherfucker, I don't dare to fight against her, but I dare to train you hard. Even if I am tired to death today, I will let you wash a layer of skin." Then, all kinds of voices sounded in the bathhouse. Fang Mu stood aside and couldn't bear to look at it. He thought that if Chu Qingning knew that the man was in the longevity realm, his expression would be so wonderful. After a full hour, the humiliated man was dressed by Chu Qingning. He looked at Chu Qingning with murderous eyes. He couldn't wait to recover his ability to move now and press Chu Qingning to death in the water. Chu Qingning laughed out loud. He felt comfortable after he vented his anger. He looked back and saw the man staring at him. He immediately pointed at his nose and scolded, "What are you looking at? If you look at me again, I will throw you into the water and train you again." "Qingning, what did you say?" Yin Shuetong's voice suddenly came from behind. Chu Qingning's complacent face suddenly became stiff. He slowly looked back and saw Yin Shuetong's face full of grievances. She cried and said, "I didn't expect you to be such a person. I will ignore you." Chapter 206. Chu Qingning's miserable howl dragged all the way. Fang Mu looked at the handsome man standing next to the bathhouse with a confused face. He was confused. Wasn't it over? He went to call Yin Shuetong. Was there anything that he couldn't understand? Fang Mu's face gradually became strange. He looked the man up and down. The man finally couldn't help but say angrily, "It's not what you think. It's the same as what Brother Qingning said." Fang Mu touched his chin and murmured. Suddenly, the man's face became uglier. "Your messy hair and beard were dealt with by Brother Qingning. You really look much younger. But I didn't expect that you are only in your 30s. I really don't understand why you want to die at such a young age." Fang Mu shook his head and reapplied the poison to the man. Then he carried the man upstairs. The man glanced at Chu Qingning and Yin Shuetong, who were quarreling in the corner of the first floor. Chu Qingning was explaining something impatiently. His forehead was sweating, but it made him feel warm. He couldn't help but miss that woman. The more he missed her, the more unwilling he was. It was not easy for him to live until now. He didn't see her. How could he be willing to die? How could he be willing to die? The young man's name was Qingning. Her name was Ning Qing. Even their names were so similar. Did God not want him to die? There was confusion in the man's eyes, and Fang Mu was still murmuring in his ears, "Senior, you should confess. Otherwise, Su Li will not let you die easily according to her character. This is our base camp in Yunjing. After she brings you here, you only have two choices. One is to die, and the other is to join our Leanly building." The man's eyes flashed. He tried to assassinate Su Li. Although he was easily solved by Su Li, he once wanted to kill Su Li. Would Su Li accept such a person? Perhaps Fang Mu felt that the man's previous experience was too miserable, so he kept talking all the way. "Senior, although I am living a good life now, a year ago, I was just driven into the barracks with a broken family and almost died on the battlefield. Finally, I fell into the prisoner camp and was saved by Miss Su Li. Miss Su Li and we have an agreement, so we will gather together. Maybe our goals are not the same, but we can help each other and support each other until we have the ability to take revenge." Fang Mu was lost in memories. In the end, he found that he seemed to have said too much. He smiled embarrassedly and carried the man into Su Li's attic. Anyway, this person was going to die. It didn't matter to talk too much with a dead person. Fang Mu didn't know that it was the agreement he just mentioned that made the man's pupils shrink, and his thoughts changed quietly. At this moment, Su Li had asked Fang Yuan to go back to practice. She was alone in the attic on the top floor. After Fang Mu put the man down, he closed the door and left. The fate of the man depended on Su Li's mood and the choice of the man. Su Li raised her eyes, and a golden light flashed in her eyes. She had confirmed that the man had not disguised himself and had been using his original appearance. She picked up the cyan long sword sent by Mu on the table, stroked the sword with her fingertips and looked at it carefully. Her fingertips tapped gently, and the sword made a light sound, like a dragon's roar. This was a peerless sword, much better than the Hongyuan sword that Ling Qinglan brought before. "You are really from the spiritual circle," Su Li suddenly said. The first sentence made the man who was ready to negotiate with Su Li confused. "How do you know?" the man said with difficulty. If the woman knew his identity and told the sect, he would be doomed. "You seem to be very nervous." Su Li smiled lightly, and her eyes were shining. She stared at the long sword and said unhurriedly, "Don't worry. I just inferred from this sword. It is not easy to get such a long sword with the forging technology of the secular world. I am afraid that there are only one or two swords in the treasury of the entire Dahan country. You are obviously an outsider and can only come from the spiritual circle." Speaking of this, Su Li raised her head with interest and said with a smile, "What? You seem to have changed your mind. Don't you want to die in silence?" "I don't want to die." The man turned his eyes with difficulty and saw the jade hairpin on the table quietly. "As you expected, I have to see someone, so I can't die." Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly, and didn't continue to ask this time. She needed to think about how to use the man in front of her to counterattack Wu Lirong. If there was no accident, it must be Wu Lirong who attacked her. She didn't know how Wu Lirong had a relationship with this person, but fortunately, Wu Lirong was not supported by the force of the spiritual circle as she thought, but just a loner who fled in embarrassment. "I heard that you have an agreement with your subordinates. Can I make an exchange with you with my life?" The man couldn't help but speak first. After changing his mind, he naturally didn't want to be dealt with by Su Li in this way, so he immediately began to actively look for opportunities. Su Li raised her eyebrows and said with a smile, "Your Excellency, your life is in my hands now. How can you exchange it? If you want to make an exchange with me, it's not impossible. How about working for me for 10 years? The man's pupils shrank slightly. "Do you dare to use me?" "Why not?" Su Li changed her sitting posture lazily and continued to say, "You should know better than me about the means of people who practice poison. If you still want to continue to attack me, I can naturally poison you for the second time, the third time. If you do it too many times, I may not be so patient, and it's better to let you die directly." The man was silent. What Su Li said was not unreasonable, but as long as he attacked fast enough, Su Li would also be injured. However, he had changed his mind now and didn't want to continue to kill Su Li. That was meaningless, because he knew that Wu Lirong was not a person who kept promises. If there was a better choice, why should he hang on to one tree? It's not my intention to attack you. It's Wu Lirong. The man said the deal he made with Wu Lirong before. When Su Li heard the two words Ning Qing, her heart couldn't help but skip a beat. There was really such a coincidence in the world. In her impression, Ning Qing had always been alone. Every time she mentioned her husband, her temperament would change greatly. However, this matter still needed to be verified. All kinds of thoughts lingered in her mind and then quieted down. Wu Lirong really didn't die. Su Li rubbed her chin and suddenly raised her head to ask a question that had nothing to do with the matter. What's your name? The man suddenly froze and didn't understand Su Li's intention. But since he had reached a dead end, he didn't intend to hide it anymore. Without hesitation, he said his name. My surname is Wen, and my name is Tingshan. My name is Wen Tingshan. Su Li's expression suddenly changed, and she blurted out, Are you Wen Tingshan of the Wanjian sect? You know the Wanjian sect. You are indeed a person of the spiritual circle. Wen Tingshan's face showed bitterness. This gamble was wrong. The Wanjian sect was offering a reward to arrest him in the spiritual circle and the martial arts circle. He fled all the way and barely escaped to the secular world to hide after being seriously injured. Unexpectedly, he fell into the hands of the people of the spiritual circle. No one would not be tempted by the reward offered by the Wanjian sect. Su Li was a young master, so that kind of reward was more attractive to her. At this moment, Wen Tingshan didn't know that Su Li was thinking about another thing. In the previous life, Wen Tingshan was the head of the Wanjian sect. He had great cultivation and was one of the few big shots standing on the pyramid of the spiritual circle. At that time, she was just an nonentity struggling at the bottom of the spiritual circle. Wen Tingshan was the existence that she needed to look up to. What she did should not affect the spiritual circle. That was to say, Wen Tingshan was so miserable in the previous life and this life. He was not only seriously injured, but also worse than a beggar. She couldn't help but be surprised. This was a big fish. If she didn't catch it, wouldn't she feel sorry for herself? Thinking of this, Su Li decisively said, Wen Tingshan, work for me for 10 years as the previous agreement. I will help you get through the difficulties and help you reunite with Ning Qing. If you can agree, the agreement between you and me will take effect immediately. This time, Wen Tingshan was completely stunned. Did Su Li know what she was talking about? In the face of the horrible reward offered by the Wanjian sect, she didn't change her expression at all? Or did she look down on the things of the Wanjian sect because of her background? For a moment, Wen Tingshan was completely confused. I'll give you time to think about it here. I'll come back in a day and a night. Su Li knew that haste did not lead to speed. She left a sentence and left with Wen Tingshan. At the moment when she passed by Wen Tingshan immediately felt that the numbness in his body receded like a tide. He could move. He looked back and saw Su Li close the door and disappear from his sight. There was a deep complexity in his eyes. Wasn't she afraid that he was just pretending to enter the Leanly building and kill her? However, she didn't notice the method of detoxification just now. If he acted rashly, he might die very quickly. Undoubtedly, he was very afraid of Su Li's poison. So now, whether he should run away and continue to pursue alone or stay, he really needed to think about it carefully. For a whole day and night, no one came to disturb him, not even a person who delivered food. Wen Tingshan seemed to turn into a sculpture, standing motionless in the room. When the morning light shone on his face the next day, his eyes instantly lit up. Life was just a gamble. He had gambled once, so why not gamble again? At this moment, Su Li opened the door. She wore a plain dress and her sleeves fluttered. She walked lightly like a fairy under the breeze. Her skin was delicate and her facial features were perfect and delicate. She was like the most beautiful work of art in the world. When Tingshan turned around and was in a daze. This eccentric and vicious girl who used poison was so breathtakingly beautiful. Could there be such a perfect woman in the world? Although he didn't want to admit it, she was indeed much more beautiful than Qing. But in his heart, there was only Ning Qing. No matter how beautiful Su Li was, he just admired her beauty. It seems that you have thought it through. Su Li floated over. Her hair was blown by the wind. She hadn't withdrawn the nothing unusual for a long time. She also needed to take a breath. She took this opportunity to test Wen Tingshan, and the result was satisfactory. Yes. Wen Tingshan calmed down. He said in a calm and firm tone, "From now on, I will regard myself as a member of the Linli building. I hope you can keep the agreement." Su Li smiled and her eyes were like crescent moons. She said, "Very good. There is finally a senior of the longevity realm in the Linli building. Give me your hand. I will solve your injury first and then talk about other things." Chapter 207. They sat down, and when Tingshan stretched out his wrist for Su Li to diagnose. Su Li's fingertips touched Wen Tingshan's pulse, and her perception immediately spread to Wen Tingshan's whole body. She was shocked by the severity of his internal injuries. 5 ribs were broken, almost 40% of his tendons and vessels were broken, and his internal organs were damaged and bleeding. It was terrible. In addition, there were more than a dozen breaths left in his tendons and vessels. That was to say, along the way, when Tingshan had fought with at least a dozen practitioners in the same realm or higher realm, and he had successfully escaped. With such a serious injury, he could suppress and assassinate her as if nothing had happened. Besides, he still had the upper hand in a head-on fight. Was this Wen Tingshan? If he was in his heyday, she was afraid that she could not defeat him. Su Li faintly felt that she seemed to have a great fighter. "Did I scare you?" When Tingshan forced a stiff and ugly smile on his face, "You should have thought of this when you agreed with us. The elders of the Wanjian sect are not easy to deal with. It was not easy for me to escape." The Wanjian sect. The people from the 10,000 Swords Pavilion were actually chasing after him. Wasn't he from the 10,000 Swords Pavilion? Su Li's expression remained unchanged, but her mind was slightly shocked. When Tingshan seemed to have misunderstood something. It seemed that she not only picked up a great senior, but also picked up a big trouble. After thinking for a moment, Su Li raised her head and said, "The self-healing ability of seniors in the longevity realm is extremely strong. Your external injuries have been healed for a long time, and only severe internal injuries are left. The state of your body is really a mess. Any warrior of the inborn realm would vomit blood and fall to the ground in such a situation. It's not wise for you to move with the genuine energy of the longevity realm. You need to stay in bed and rest. Leave the recuperation to me." When Tingshan looked at Su Li murmuring and taking out a piece of paper to write down the prescription. The vigilance in his eyes slowly faded away. At this moment, Su Li really became a doctor, with a focused and sacred look. The perfect combination of a poison master and a pharmacist was like the existence of half angel and half devil, revealing a strong evil spirit. But her angelic appearance made him unable to associate her with a poison master. What a contradictory existence, when Tingshan sighed in his heart. On the other side, Su Li also put down the pen and paper. She said with a smile, "Next, we have to ask Protector Shan to suffer for a period of bitter treatment." When Tingshan saw the dense treatment plans on the table, he couldn't help but smile bitterly. Then he suddenly remembered something and shook his head. I made an appointment with Wu Lirong to see her within 3 days. My head." Su Li smiled gently. "I don't have anything else, but I have a lot of skulls. I can lend them to you. By the way, I have never met the person who killed my mother. Protector Shan, please introduce me to him." Su Li's tone was normal, as if she was visiting an old friend. But when Tingshan heard that the killing intent was more fierce than a hysterical cry for revenge, he could understand how ruthless Su Li was to kill her mother. But what did she mean by borrowing the head? After a quarter of an hour, when Tingshan put on his original clothes, put on a bamboo hat and stood in the stone room. Looking at a large number of coffins in the stone room, he finally understood what Su Li meant by "there are a lot of skulls." Su Li pointed to the new 20 coffins and said, "These are the corpse puppets robbed from the Lianxia cult. No matter how you use them, you won't feel distressed. Since you can make Wu Lirong fake her death, it should not be difficult for you to disguise the corpse puppets, right?" When Tingshan nodded blankly. The corpse puppets robbed, he had also heard of the Lianxia cult. It was a top force in the martial arts circle. Such a force should be robbed by Su Li. Looking at the 20 corpse puppets, all of which were above the inborn realm, Wen Tingshan could imagine how painful it would be for the Lianxia cult to lose these corpse puppets. At this time, Yin Xuetong pushed the door and came in. Seeing Wen Tingshan with a cold face, she said, "Protector Shan, nice to meet you." Wen Tingshan was stunned, and then nodded gently. He didn't know why there was a strange feeling in his heart. When he was called first senior fellow apprentice by thousands of disciples in the Wanjian sect, he didn't feel anything. Su Li, most of the faces of the 20 corpse puppets were injured by hidden weapons before, and they need to be repaired. Only the faces of number 14 and number 16 are intact and can be used for disguise. Yin Xuetong opened a booklet and said. She had a detailed record of the various military arrangements in the Linli building. She was shocked when she saw Su Li refining the corpse puppets. She felt that the skill of refining the corpse was too terrifying. Later, after the rainy night in the Wu family, Yin Xuetong's cognition was immediately distorted by Su Li. With her own ability and profound insight, Su Li easily let the people of the Lianxia cult and the Hehuan sect bite each other. She was so wise. Then I will use number 16. Su Li sat down and made a decision. She asked casually, "By the way, where is Chu Qingning? Why didn't I see him just now?" Hearing the name of Chu Qingning, Wen Tingshan's eyes were immediately brighter than light bulbs. His wolf-like eyes immediately made Yin Xuetong's scalp numb. Yin Xuetong smiled awkwardly and said, "Qingning said he wanted to go out to avoid the trouble. What did he do?" Su Li was confused. She really didn't know what Chu Qingning did. But judging from Wen Tingshan's angry look, it was probably not a good thing. Hearing that Chu Qingning slipped away, Wen Tingshan snorted coldly and said in a deep voice, "He has self-awareness. Otherwise, even if you stop me, I will beat him up." At this moment, Chu Qingning, who had hidden out of the city, was lying on the crooked tree on the low hill beside the official road. His face was full of bad luck. Hearing that Yin Xuetong told him that Wen Tingshan not only surrendered, but also was a senior of the longevity realm, he was so scared that his face turned green. If he had known that Wen Tingshan was a senior of the longevity sword, he would not have offended him anyway. Fang Mu clearly knew it, but he didn't remind him. "I didn't bring any money, so I can only go to the mountain to hunt. I am thinking about how to go back." Chu Qingning scratched his head and couldn't think of a way to deal with it. He could only turn over and jump off the crooked tree. He was about to rush to the depths of the forest. At this moment, a long caravan appeared on the official road. Chu Qingning fixed his eyes on it and immediately saw the flag in front of the caravan from a distance. It turns out to be the cloth shop under the jurisdiction of the embroidery workshop in Yunjing City. But doesn't the cloth shop in Yunjing only transport goods into the city every half a month? The last time they entered the city was less than 10 days ago. Why did they come again? With the help of Chu Lu, they were very well informed. They knew the inflow channels of various forces in Yunjing City. The cloth shop shortened the delivery time. If there was no accident, some people from the martial arts circle sneaked into the city. "Tut tut, don't worry. There are still 2 months before the 8th day of the 12th lunar month," Chu Qingning murmured. Suddenly, he fixed his eyes and saw an acquaintance. A young manservant mingled with the shop assistants in the cloth shop, kept his head down and walked with the caravan. It seemed that he was tired of bowing his head. He raised his head and moved. Coincidentally, Chu Qingning saw his face. Lin Yanxing. Wasn't he Lin Yanxing? Chu Qingning was so shocked that his eyes almost popped out. How long had it been since Lin Yanxing was exiled last year? Not only was he saved on the way of exile, but he also recovered and could move so quickly. Being stared at by Chu Qingning, Lin Yanxing suddenly felt something. He suddenly turned his head and saw a crooked tree swaying in the wind. He was confused. Then someone seemed to say something to him. He immediately lowered his head and walked with the caravan again. Chu Qingning hid behind him and swallowed. He was covered with a layer of cold sweat. Wow, this guy not only recovered, but also made rapid progress in cultivation. He could even find that Chu Qingning was peeping at him. Which force is it? Their medical skills are comparable to Su Li's. It is not easy for the Wu family to be cleaned up in the city. It seems that there are many ruthless people coming. Chu Qingning murmured and watched the caravan go away. Suddenly, his eyes brightened. If he told Su Li about this, he might be able to get protection from Wen Tingshan. Haha, Lin Yanxing, you are really my savior. Chu Qingning was excited and immediately went back. At this moment, Wen Tingshan quietly left the Linli building. He put on a bamboo hat and took the ball-shaped thing wrapped in rags. He silently walked through the alley and returned to the bungalow where he hid. He was completely silent. He didn't need to do anything more. Wu Lirong would definitely come within 3 days. In the past 3 days, Wu Lirong had been secretly monitoring the affiliated school of the National Academy. Since Su Li went out in the morning 2 days ago, she had never come back. At this moment, the people of the Lord Rui's mansion had sent troops to search the whole city quietly. The news had not spread yet, but she couldn't help being excited. That senior took action. Sure enough, Su Li had no chance to resist in the hands of such a person. As long as she went to the bungalow again, she might see Su Li's bloody head. But she didn't dare. At least not now. Although the senior knew that she faked her death, he didn't know that she had lost the ability to send people of the Wu mansion. If she went there and was exposed, she might die in the hands of that person. The horror of a few days ago was still vivid in Wu Lirong's mind. Fear and viciousness flashed in her eyes. She had to find a way to deal with it. Time went by unknowingly. On the 3rd day, the people of the Lord Rui's mansion had been searching crazily and alarmed the city guards. They gradually intended to expand the search scope. Wu Lirong was afraid that Wen Tingshan would escape directly. Although she was not fully prepared, she still went to the bungalow. As soon as she opened the door, Wu Lirong smelled a bloody smell. Her pupils shrank and she saw Wen Tingshan still sitting in the original position. There was a head wrapped in white cloth beside him. She looked happy and wanted to confirm it, but she was scolded by Wen Tingshan. Wait. Wu Lirong was slightly stiff. Senior, why? Wen Tingshan's eyes were cold. Although he joined Su Li, he still wanted to confirm some things. I have done 2 things for you. When will you send someone to help me find Ning Qing? Hearing Wen Tingshan's cold question, Wu Lirong had already prepared for it. She promised without panic, don't worry. In the 3 days when you were busy killing Su Li, I was not idle. I had already sent someone to investigate the news. Now I have invited all the Ning Qing in Yunjing City back to the Wu mansion. As long as you show me their heads, I will bring them to you immediately. Chapter 208. Of course. Wu Lirong nodded without hesitation. Wen Tingshan narrowed his eyes and slowly uncovered the rag. Seeing that Wen Tingshan was fooled, Wu Lirong was overjoyed and stared at the head intently. The blood on the head of the corpse puppet was not fresh, but it was enough to deceive a secular woman. After seeing Su Li's beautiful but blood-stained face, Wu Lirong immediately laughed crazily. It's her. It's Su Li. Ha 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 ha, Dongfang Rui. I will let you live in hell all the time. Don't expect to be relaxed for the rest of your life. Hatred and jealousy intertwined on Wu Lirong's face, which made her look like a devil and a ghost. Wen Tingshan felt extremely uncomfortable. He quickly grabbed Wu Lirong's neck. Wu Lirong immediately stopped talking, and the ecstasy on her face turned into deep fear. Senior, Wen Tingshan gloomily said, now, let me go to see Qingning immediately. Wu Lirong covered her neck and struggled violently. Hearing Wen Tingshan's words, she sneered in a low voice, break my neck if you can. I won't let you see the woman named Qingning for the rest of your life. She really burned the bridge after crossing it. Wen Tingshan's eyes narrowed, and he didn't feel guilty about violating the agreement. He slapped Wu Lirong unconscious, leaving her shocked. She had clearly laid the groundwork before. She comforted Wen Tingshan by saying that she found Qingning, and then threatened him with the existence of Qingning. Wen Tingshan cared about that woman so much, so he should be cautious. Why did he slap her unconscious without hesitation? Wasn't she afraid that she would kill her? After the darkness, Wu Lirong woke up from a dizzy state. She looked around and found that she was tied up in a stone room with walls on all sides. She suddenly panicked and couldn't help shouting, "Senior, I know I'm wrong. Please let me go. I will take you to the Wu mansion to find the woman named Ning Qing." Before she finished her words, the door of the stone room opened quietly. Wu Lirong immediately looked over, but when she saw the girl standing behind the door, her joy immediately turned into dullness. Su Li was still alive. Impossible. You little bitch, you are dead. How could he still be alive? The great anger made Wu Lirong forget his own situation and madly abused. Su Li impatiently picked her nails and slapped Wu Lirong's cheek with one hand. Pa! This slap was fierce and resounding. Phut! Wu Lirong turned her head and spat out a mouthful of blood. Her lips wriggled as she spat out several teeth. The sharp pain in her mouth finally woke her up. Her face was full of fear and panic. At this moment, Wen Tingshan, who had changed into clean clothes, came in from the door. Wu Lirong saw Wen Tingshan, who was like a different person, and finally understood that Wen Tingshan had chosen to surrender to Su Li. The head was fake like hers. But why did this silly girl have the ability to make him surrender? She couldn't help showing resentment in her eyes. Su Li's calm voice sounded softly, "If you dare to show such a look again, believe it or not, I will dig out your eyes first." Wu Lirong's body trembled violently. She looked at Su Li's face with trembling hands, but she saw that Su Li still had a delicate smile on her face. It seemed that gouging out eyeballs was as common as eating and drinking tea, which was not even worthy of Su Li's killing intent. "I heard from my protector Shan that you have found Qingning in the Wu mansion." Su Li walked lightly and turned behind Wu Lirong. She whispered in her ear, "Can you tell me about the family background of the girl named Qingning? Are her parents still alive? What's her name?" Wu Lirong's scalp was covered with goosebumps. She was flustered, but she didn't dare to show it on her face. She knew that the Ning Qing fabricated by her was probably the last straw for her to survive. But she didn't find her at all. How could she answer Su Li's words? "Speak." When Tingshan's face darkened and he roared coldly, Wu Lirong trembled with fear and cried, "I'll speak. I'll speak. I was in a hurry to find her. How could I investigate so much? I only know that she is a widow." Su Li's eyes flashed. "Where did you find her?" Yes. Let me think." Wu Lirong's face couldn't stop shaking violently. Many places appeared in her mind. Su Li's question completely baffled her. Damn it, this little bitch was as despicable and shameless as her mother. Seeing that when Tingshan took a step forward, Wu Lirong was so scared that she almost peed her pants. She shouted regardless of anything, "It's in Yunjing City. It's in Yunjing City." When Tingshan hesitated, Wu Lirong's words were indeed full of doubts, but he didn't dare to bet on Ning Qing's life. Su Li smiled faintly. Wu Lirong did have some intelligence, but unfortunately, she met Su Li well. "If you want to live a little longer, I'll let you enjoy it," Su Li said with a smile and winked at Wen Tingshan. They left the adytum. Wu Lirong breathed a sigh of relief. She recovered her mind and asked. There was a smell between her legs. She was so scared that she peed her pants just now. Her face immediately became red, as if she had suffered the harshest humiliation in the world. "Little bitch, why didn't you die?" When Tingshan followed Su Li back to the attic on the top floor. After hesitating for a moment, he said, "Su Li, can you keep her alive for a few more days? Let me investigate this matter, and then, does Ning Qing have a father who is a teacher, Ning Yunji?" Su Li suddenly interrupted Wen Tingshan. What she said made him stunned. Why did Su Li seem to know Ning Qing's whereabouts after one day? Was Wu Lirong lying? Or was Su Li lying? Wen Tingshan saw that Su Li's words were more credible at a glance. He was silent for a moment and nodded. "When I met Qing in Yunjing City, she did say that her father was a pedantic teacher. As for his name, I don't know." Ning Qing had been to Yunjing. Su Li raised her eyebrows slightly. No wonder Wen Tingshan came here to find her. Ning Qing had already left Yunjing, a sad place. She smiled slightly and sat down at the table. She picked up the brush and began to paint without saying a word. Wen Tingshan couldn't help but walk to the side to watch. When he saw that Su Li only drew a rough outline of the facial features, he couldn't help trembling with excitement. Although it was just an outline, the familiarity engraved in his soul made him tremble involuntarily. Su Li's wrist shook quickly, and she painted very fast. Soon, Ning Qing's current appearance was perfectly presented on the rice paper. Looking at the familiar person in the painting, Wen Tingshan picked up the paper with trembling hands. His eyes, which had never shed tears even when he was seriously injured, were quickly wet. How many years had passed? On the Wanjian mountain, he thought about Ning Qing all the time. He was afraid that Ning Qing had forgotten that he had a new lover. He was full of guilt and would rather she didn't wait for him. No matter how much pain and reason he had let her down after all. How many 20 years did she have before she reached the inborn realm? If he asked her to wait for him, it would be too selfish. Wu Lirong is right about one thing. Ms. Ning Qing has been alone all these years. Like her father, she has become a teacher. If you want to see her, you can go to the Qinghe town in the Qinghe province. She teaches in the Qinghe girls' school. That's all. But I still advise you to wait until you recover. Su Li persuaded him, but Wen Tingshan didn't respond at all. She shook her head and went downstairs alone. Wu Lirong was useless to Wen Tingshan since she gave the news of Ning Qing. Naturally, she could do whatever she wanted. Bang! The underground adytum was kicked open. Wu Lirong suddenly raised her head and saw Su Li coming alone. She slowly approached and suddenly struggled violently. Su Li, you can't kill me. I was your mother's good sister. How can you kill me? How dare you kill me? Where is that senior? Let him come. I still need him. Su Li closed the door and walked to Wu Lirong. She pulled a chair and sat down. She looked very calm. How did you kill my mother, her? Wu Lirong's breath stagnated, and her sophistry immediately disappeared. Don't talk. Su Li's eyes sparkled and her eyelashes trembled slightly. She pinched Wu Lirong's thumb with one hand and then crushed it. Ah 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 ah. A sharp scream immediately resounded through the adytum. Unfortunately, the adytum was built according to Su Li's instructions. Even if Wu Lirong's voice was 10 times louder, it couldn't pass through. Su Li seemed not to hear Wu Lirong's scream. She still smiled and said, "Don't tell me." She took a handkerchief and wiped her bloody fingertips. Then she gently moved the index finger that pinched Wu Lirong's. Fear immediately climbed up Wu Lirong's sweaty face. She screamed without hesitation, "I'll tell you. I'll tell you. Stop pinching." As soon as Wu Lirong said that, Su Li let go of her hand. Wu Lirong didn't want to live at this moment. She just wanted to suffer less. She immediately told Su Li everything she had done in the past. At that time, I happened to know that Su Yun had a biological sister named Su Yun. She came back to Yunjing once a year to visit her. I knew that Su Yun absolutely trusted her sister. On the night before her wedding, I gathered people to kill her, but her sister really came back. That Su Yu was extremely powerful. She blocked all of my subordinates by herself. I could only watch as Su Yun was saved. Later, the reinforcements of the Wu mansion came. Su Yu was seriously injured and fled. I took people to chase her. Unexpectedly, that bitch. Crack. Su Li's index finger was crushed. Blood splashed everywhere. Su Li's tone became softer. Who are you calling a bitch? Ah. Wu Lirong rolled her eyes in pain. It was very difficult for her to scream. She said, I am a bitch. I am wrong. I am a bitch. Su Li let go of her hand and smiled. Go on. If you say something wrong again, it will not be as simple as a finger. Wu Lirong trembled. She looked at Su Li with fear in her eyes. Devil. Su Li was a complete devil. She was different from her kind-hearted mother. There was no good or evil in her eyes. I thought that I could catch her immediately if I went out of the city, but I didn't know why I didn't find her. Later, I took people to search all over Yunjing City and all the places outside Yunjing City. My people were mixed in the hands of Lord Rui. No one found that a small group of people wanted to kill your mother. But after searching for a few months, I still found nothing. Chapter 209. So what? Su Li tilted her head, and her eyes were dark. Wu Lirong seemed to see the burning ghost fire in her deep eyes. That was the flame of anger and hatred that wanted to burn her up. Ha 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 ha, Wu Lirong suddenly laughed maniacally. Little slut, you're very angry, aren't you? I heard that you were very miserable when you were a child. You didn't feel the slightest family affection. You were adopted by a vicious woman and were beaten all day long. Su Li's smile slowly disappeared. She stood up, but she didn't pinch Wu Lirong's fingers again. She let Wu Lirong continue to talk. You were miserable, and so was your father. Back then, I tortured your mother to the end. Even when she died, she didn't say a single word about you. I couldn't calm my hatred, so I cut your mother open and threw away all the things in her body. Later, your father's loyal commander picked up your mother's body bit by bit along the path and put them together. You don't know that your father was crazy. He went crazy on the day he saw your mother's body. If Wu Bin didn't keep persuading him to bury Su Yun, your father would have been a complete lunatic now. Ha 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 ha. I hate you. Why didn't I find that you were the bastard left by Su Yun earlier? Dongfang Rui actually found you. I hate you. Wu Lirong screamed crazily, and her hair was disheveled like a devil. Su Li was expressionless. She stepped away and crushed 5 fingers of Wu Lirong's right foot. The hoarse scream sounded again, accompanied by Su Li's cold and calm voice. Apologize. Apologize for what? Crack. Wu Lirong's left toes were all broken. She was in so much pain that she foamed at the mouth and rolled her eyes. But she could still hear the faint voice clearly. Apologize to my mother, now, immediately. Bah. Wu Lirong smiled ferociously and spat at Su Li's face. Little bitch, even if you crush all my fingers, I won't say a word of apology. Never in this life. Really? Su Li grabbed Wu Lirong's right hand with one hand and crushed Wu Lirong's whole palm like a chicken claw. More shrill screams echoed in the adytum, but Wu Lirong still did not apologize. Soon, Wu Lirong's limbs were all hanging limply. She lowered her head and panted heavily. She was actually so stubborn that she didn't even say a word of apology. Very good. Su Li wiped the blood on her face and smiled brightly. She said, Mrs. Wu, you really have a good perseverance. However, I like that you can hold on. I haven't had enough fun. Wu Lirong looked up in horror and her pupils contracted. Her limbs were all broken. What else could Su Li do? Then, Wu Lirong saw the most unforgettable scene in her life. Su Li raised her palm, and a burst of dense green light flashed. Then the green light automatically dispersed into 4 groups and flew to her limbs. A strange itch came from her limbs, and her limbs recovered after a few breaths. This also meant that she would have to go through the same torturous method again. Perhaps there would be a 3rd time, a 4th time. As long as she didn't relent, there would be 100 times. At that time, could she still bear it? Wu Lirong's face was pale and her lips were trembling. Are you a human or a ghost? What answered her was the explosion of her right thumb. Ah 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 ah. The familiar screams came from the adytum again and continued, until the next morning. For a whole night, Fang Yuan stood in front of the adytum and listened to the sound inside the door. He didn't dare to open the door to have a look. He could feel the darkness in Su Li's heart was expanding through the door. If he opened the door at this time, it would definitely not be a good result. In the adytum, Su Li gasped slightly. The wood stars were not endless and she also had a limit. But obviously, Wu Lirong couldn't hold on first. Let me die. Please, Su Li, I was wrong. I want to apologize to your mother. Wu Lirong looked up and begged weakly. After experiencing too many broken limbs, the string in her mind had already broken. Taking a deep breath, Su Li stood up with a pious expression on her face. Her voice was still clear and melodious. I will say 1 sentence and you will say 1 sentence. I am Wu Lirong. I am Wu Lirong. You killed Su Yun and are unforgivable. You killed Su Yun and are unforgivable. Today, I am willing to die to apologize. Today. Wu Lirong's eyes suddenly changed and she swallowed the second half of the sentence. But Su Li stepped on her kneecap and forced her to say it. Say it. If you don't say it, do you want to continue the previous game? Wu Lirong trembled violently and said with difficulty, Today, I am willing to die to apologize. After death, I am willing to go to hell and suffer 16 kinds of torture to apologize for escaping for 16 years. If there is an afterlife, I should be a chicken or a duck in Suyun's mouth and a cow or a horse. I will be a beast forever. After that, Wu Lirong stopped. But Su Li crushed the bones of her right arm with one palm. Read it. Continue to read it. Read it word by word. I, Wu Lirong, killed Suyun and are unforgivable. I, Wu Lirong, killed Suyun and are unforgivable. I, Wu Lirong, killed Suyun. When Wu Lirong read it for the 7th time, Su Li crushed her throat with one hand and finally let her die. The smell of blood was thick in the adytum. Su Li took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Mother, did you hear it? Wu Lirong is apologizing to you. She will atone for the sins of thousands of generations. I will make you happy in this life and then go to heaven to accompany you. In the silent stone room, only Su Li's echo was like a sigh. Early the next morning, Su Li appeared in the sight of Lord Rui's mansion. Lord Rui's mansion didn't want to eat or drink these days. They were so anxious that they almost fell down. As soon as they heard the news of Su Li, they immediately rushed over. Where have you been? Seeing that Su Li's clothes were clean and tidy and her smile was shallow, Dongfang Rui was relieved. He couldn't help rushing up and hugged her tightly. He suppressed his voice and said, I thought you were like your mother and didn't want me anymore. Su Li gently patted Dongfang Rui's back and chuckled, how could it be? Father. I will take good care of you in the future and don't let mother worry. Dongfang Rui's body immediately froze. He heard something. Su Li actually called him father? Dongfang Rui suddenly broke away from Su Li's arms. He held Su Li's shoulders and looked up and down. He was suspicious. Su Li couldn't help but laugh. Dongfang Rui had been cheated so many times that he even learned to use his brain. Did he suspect that she was a fake? I am Su Li, not someone else. Su Li gently pushed away Dongfang Rui's hand and said, although I admit your identity, I will not become Dongfang Li. My mother didn't marry into the Dongfang family, so I won't. If you can accept it, come to the affiliated school of the National Academy to find me. Then, Su Li bypassed Dongfang Rui, who was still in a daze. Wu Bin looked at Su Li, who wanted to take care of both sides. Su Li slowly walked away. Before Su Li went far, Dongfang Rui woke up. He quickly turned around and chased Su Li. Li, wait for your father. There is a carriage. Why do you waste your energy? Su Li stopped and looked back with a smile. At that moment, Dongfang Rui's eyes were wet and 2 lines of tears flowed down. His heart was completely melted at this moment. This time, there was no so-called banquet in Lord Rui's mansion. However, Lord Rui went to the National Academy every 2 or 3 days and told everyone he met that Su Li had recognized him. He was so proud, like a child showing off his toys everywhere. Wu Bin, who had been following Lord Rui, didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Wu Lirong died. Su Li recognized her master. Her master, who had lived a miserable life for 16 years, finally had a good ending. Of course, they didn't know that the real Wu Lirong went to hell with continuous apologies after being tortured by Su Li for a day and a night. Su Yu, who was still busy in the Juyu winery, heard the drinkers talking about Su Li's recent situation. She was stunned at first, and then her eyes became soft. She didn't expect that Su Li would forgive Dongfang Rui so easily. Could she also, seeing his wife's appearance, Shen Jingju couldn't help but sigh softly. The knot in his heart had to be untied. But Su Li was not simple. He didn't tell Su Yu about what happened in the Linli building. Su Yu could bear the guilt. So, he would investigate it clearly. On this day, Su Li was studying when Tingshan's prescription in the room. It was the first time for her to contact a senior of the longevity realm. While treating his injury, she naturally wanted to test the various functions of the physical body of the longevity realm. Mammy Lee's voice suddenly sounded outside the door. Miss, Lord comes to see you. Got it. I'm coming. Su Li put down the prescription and got up to open the door to the front hall of the affiliated school. Mammy Lee followed her happily. She was very happy that Miss was willing to recognize Lord Rui. Only she knew Su Li's suffering in these years. Because she knew it, she knew how difficult it was for Su Li to let go of everything in the past and recognize Lord Rui. In the front hall, Dongfang Rui was looking at the empty school. There were many books on the lesson plan that Su Li thanked personally. He picked up a book and opened it. The handwriting was graceful and beautiful. He really liked it. Dad, why are you here again? These days, you come here more often than those playboys in the school. Su Li's teasing voice came. Dongfang Rui looked up and couldn't help but laugh loudly. Why can't I come to see my daughter? If you are willing to live in the Lord Rui's mansion, I don't have to work so hard. Su Li shook her head slightly and said, the affiliated school is entrusted to me by my master. It also contains the intention of my senior fellow apprentice. Dad, I have made up my mind on this matter. You don't need to persuade me. Dongfang Rui shook his head and sighed bitterly. You and your mother are the same. I can't persuade you, so I can only bring people to you. Who are they? Su Li raised her eyebrows and guessed. People of the Yunj sect. Dongfang Rui said with a smile, after today, the Yunj sect will be changed to the Li sect. I originally prepared them for you. Now they are handed over to you. Su Li seemed to feel something and looked out of the door. As expected, she saw acquaintances whom she had fought many times in the previous life approaching slowly. They all knelt down and saluted respectfully. Miss. There were 5 women and 5 men. They were all in their early 20s and had reached the inborn 3rd hurdle. They were opponents in the previous life and subordinates in this life. How mysterious it was. Su Li glanced at their young faces and narrowed her eyes slightly. Get up. In the previous life, when she fought with them for the first time, she killed 3 people in a siege of 10 people. She didn't resent these 10 people. The existence of Su Zipei forced them to oppose her, which was also a tragedy. Dad, you don't have to change the name. Su Li looked back and smiled. I like the name of the Yunj sect very much. Dongfang Rui smiled and nodded. The Yunj sect is already yours. Whatever you say. The 10 people who met their master for the first time felt relieved when they heard this. The Yunj sect was their belief. If it was changed rashly, they would be slightly uncomfortable. It was better that Su Li didn't change the name. It seems that the future master is as kind and easy to get along with as the rumors say. Chapter 210. After handing over the Yunj sect to Su Li, Dongfang Rui seemed to be relieved and smiled more. There were more than 10 people in the Yunj sect. It was a small sect in the martial arts circle with hundreds of people. This time, 1/10 of them came. They were the best elites cultivated by the Yunj sect. They were the pillars of the Yunj sect. The affiliated school was too small for Yun Yi and others to live. After meeting Su Li, they settled in the nearest yard to the affiliated school and secretly protected Su Li. After buying the original residence, Su Yi asked Su and others to clean up the house. Then he came to the back door of the yard. The terrain was quite high. Looking at the affiliated school of the National Academy from the back door, he could see the safety of the affiliated school of the National Academy. If someone wanted to climb over the wall secretly, he couldn't escape their eyes. The head is still young. She only learned medical skills from the miracle working doctor before. Her cultivation is still shallow. If she takes over the affairs of the martial arts circle, it will be a little shameful. Anyway, the Yunj sect finally has a master. Unisin let out a deep sigh and her eyes lit up. Just as a country couldn't live without a king, the sect in the martial arts circle would be in a state of disunity if there was no master. It was difficult to survive for a long time. The nature of the Yunj sect was different. It was supported by the Lord Rui's mansion. Yun Yi was just an orphan wandering around in the early years of war. He was selected by the Yunj sect and got rid of the life of fighting for food with wild dogs. Although the practice and training were very hard, he felt very happy as long as he had enough food and a place to sleep. Later, as he slowly grew up, his outstanding performance allowed his status to continue to rise. His heart also became more and more confused. Ever since he was a child, he had looked forward to having a full meal and warm clothes, but now he was suddenly living the life of his dreams. Furthermore, he had mastered martial arts. The rest of his life suddenly became dull and boring. Finally, one year, Lord Rui came and gave him the name of Yun Yi. The words of Lord Rui still echoed in his heart. The master of the Yunj sect is not me. It can only be my long-lost daughter. As long as she doesn't show up, the Yunj sect will continue to look for her. Your mission is to guard her for a lifetime and not let her be hurt. If her order is to kill me, you must absolutely obey. Under the brainwashing of Prince Rui, a group of young boys and girls who lacked faith were given the belief that they could fight for their entire lives. He was 12 years old when he entered the Cloud Pavilion, and now he was 26 years old. The faith he had been instilled in him for 14 years had become indestructible. Today, when Yun Yi saw Su Li, who was 10 years younger than him and was so delicate and pretty like a next-door girl, his desire to protect her became stronger. In this life, I will protect my master's safety. Yun Yi looked at the affiliated school of the National Academy and swore. At this moment, the master that Yun Yi wanted to protect was not in the affiliated school. Instead, he changed into Mr. Li and appeared in the Linli building. Because a guest came to the Linli building. Su Li waved her hand, and the wine glass flew over the space and fell on the table. This time, Ling Qinglan did not dodge in panic, but smiled slightly and nodded to thank her. Lord Ling is very busy, why do you have the time to drink here? Hearing Su Li's gentle words as usual, Ling Qinglan smiled bitterly and said, Mr. Li, you must be joking. This time, I am not looking for you, but our hierarch. I come here to send an invitation. Child Li. Su Li smiled lightly and said, your child is not an idle person. This time, he suddenly invited me. Ling Qinglan's eyes flashed. He held his fists and said, Mr. Li, you are my savior. I should not hide something from you, so I will be frank. On that rainy night in the Wu family, did you do something behind the scenes? Su Li raised her eyebrows and slowly held the wine glass in her hand. Why do you think it was me? Ling Qinglan shook his head and smiled. Hierarch thinks that only you can weaken 80% of the outside forces in the capital secretly without doing anything to us. On that day, the Enmore cult also took action. But before they played a role, everything was over. Su Li's action took the initiative, so that the Enmore cult could not do anything this time. Su Li narrowed her eyes slightly. So, Ling Li prepared to thank her, so he held a banquet. She faintly felt that there was another purpose in this matter. Ling Li's temper could not be so simple. However, she now had Wen Tingshan by her side. She was not afraid of being exposed as Mr. Li. She still had to go to this banquet. Thinking of this, Su Li cupped her hands and smiled lightly. Since Hierarch invites me, how can I not go? Ling Qinglan smiled and took out the invitation and put it on the side of the table. Then, I will wait for Mr. Li. Then, Ling Qinglan was about to leave. His only purpose this time was to invite Ms. Li. The reason why he came to send the invitation in person was to show that he attached importance to Ms. Li. If he sent a random person to send the invitation, he was afraid that Ms. Li would be annoyed. By the way, Lord Ling, please wait. Su Li took the invitation and suddenly remembered something. She stopped Ling Qinglan. Ling Qinglan turned his head in confusion and saw Su Li squinting her eyes. She asked softly, I heard that Lord Ling has been investigating the unsolved case of the Yi family, right? Ling Qinglan was slightly shocked. After hesitating for a moment, he nodded gently and said, I have some connections with the Yi family. Although he didn't say Yi Mo, he knew that Mr. Li was smart and could definitely guess something. Mr. Li already knew many of his secrets, so it didn't make any difference. Moreover, his investigation was not a secret. Although he had many unsolved cases to cover up the real purpose of investigating the unsolved case of the Yi family, it was easy for people like Su Li to see the difference. Seeing that Ling Qinglan told her frankly, Su Li smiled slightly. I was going to tell you about it a few days ago, but a lot of things happened, so I put it off. Since you are here today, I will tell you. Su Li crooked her fingers, and a scroll automatically flew out from the bookshelf behind her and fell into Ling Qinglan's hands. Ling Qinglan lowered his head and stroked the scented scroll with his fingers. His heart was beating wildly. Had Mr. Li found out who the real murderer of the Yi family was? It was impossible. He didn't get the result for so many years. No matter how powerful Mr. Li was, he was only born 14 years ago. How could he know too much? He forced himself to calm down, opened the file, and read it. His face immediately became incomparably cold and solemn. What was written on the scroll was exactly what Chen Gong said to Xian Jingju when he came over. He knew nothing about all kinds of strange things at that time. Sure enough, it was blocked. A cold light flashed in Ling Qinglan's eyes. His relationship with Chen Gong was not close before, and there was a grudge left by the vicious competition between the Supreme Judiciary and the Ministry of Penalty. But this time, even if Chen Gong didn't like him, he would visit him in person. Ling Qinglan, there was something strange about the matter at that time. Someone deliberately didn't allow you to unite with Chen Gong. If you want to take action, you should be careful. Don't lose your calm. Su Li's cold voice suddenly sounded. Ling Qinglan came to his sense. He stood up and bowed respectfully. I understand. Mr. Li, you helped me so much, and I can't repay you. If one day I can find the real murderer and kill the enemy, I will definitely come to have a drink and talk with you. It's a deal. Goodbye. Ling Qinglan cupped his hands and turned around. When he was about to leave, Wen Tingshan came into the room from outside. This person was so strange, Ling Qinglan was confused. He and Ling Li still knew nothing about the origin of the Linli building. The Enmore cult only found another Linli building in the Qinghe town after several investigations. No one knew where the seniors of the Linli building came from and how many arrangements there were. Everyone seemed to appear out of thin air and didn't exist in this world. But everyone who appeared so far could be called a genius, because they were not only young but also practiced incredibly fast. Now, Ling Qinglan suddenly saw an old man of the Linli building. He was naturally curious, and then he looked at him a few more times, when Tingshan frowned slightly and turned to see Ling Qinglan's face. This was Ling Qinglan of the Supreme Judiciary, the lackey of the Dongfang family. Chapter 211. Protector Shan, he is not an enemy. Hearing Su Li's voice, Wen Tingshan withdrew his momentum and looked slightly stiff. He showed an apologetic expression and said with a fist and palm salute, I'm sorry. I'm not used to being stared at. Ling Qinglan quickly returned the salute and said, never mind, never mind. It's my fault. But in his heart, he was aghast. This person's imposing aura was really terrifying. His cultivation had already reached the 5th level of the congenital realm after he had recovered from his serious injuries. But under the oppression of this person, he actually felt a deep despair, as if as long as this person attacked, he would absolutely be unable to survive. He had never felt this kind of feeling from Ling Li. Ling Li was already at the peak of the inborn realm, then this person, Ling Qinglan's pupils shrank slightly. Longevity realm. The background of the Linli building was more terrible than he had imagined. After Ling Qinglan left, Su Li smiled helplessly. This scene was not arranged by her. It was purely a coincidence. She was not going to accept the gratitude of the Enmore cult. She would not gain anything if she rashly shocked Ling Qinglan. Protector Shan, why are you here? When Tingshan was still confused about Ling Qinglan's identity, he couldn't help but say, is he Ling Qinglan, the officer of the Supreme Judiciary? Su Li nodded gently, and when Tingshan's face immediately became gloomy, the Dongfang family is not easy to deal with. They had a relationship with the Wanjian sect in the early years. If they recognize me, I'm afraid. Su Li's expression changed slightly. It was the first time for her to hear that the Dahan dynasty was related to the Wanjian sect. If Wen Tingshan didn't mention it today, she would suffer a lot in the future. Could it be that my husband failed in my previous life because of the 10,000 Swords Pavilion? Su Li's expression became a little uncertain, which immediately made Wen Tingshan misunderstand. His eyes flashed with killing intent, and he suggested aloud, why don't I catch up with her now, in case of accidents? Su Li came back to her senses and explained, don't worry. Even if he recognizes you, he won't tell others. If Ling Qinglan is in the Supreme Judiciary, it will not belong to the Dongfang family. Wen Tingshan was stunned. After thinking about it, he finally understood what Su Li meant. It turned out that Ling Qinglan was not loyal to the Dongfang family. By the way, you still haven't told me why you're here today. According to my arrangements, you should still be resting in bed right now. What, you can't bear it anymore? Wen Tingshan looked ashamed. I'm afraid that the medicine you gave me these days will be wasted. Su Li raised her eyebrows and realized that Wen Tingshan was implying something. She suddenly said, "Are you going to the Qinghe girls' school?" Wen Tingshan nodded silently. Su Li shook her head with disappointment in her eyes. "I understand your feelings very well. You can't wait to stand in front of Ning Qing in the next moment and tell him everything that has happened over the years. But have you ever thought about where the people of the 10,000 Swords Pavilion are now?" When Tingshan's expression changed slightly, he frowned and said, "After I returned to the sect, I didn't suggest Qing'e. I even set up a camouflage near Tianji country. They should still be wandering there. But it won't be long before they find Dahan country. If the Dongfang family joins hands with them, then, that's why you can't look for her now." Su Li interrupted Wen Tingshan and said coldly, "It's a long way to the Qinghe province. Even if you don't stop for a moment, it will take at least 7 days. In addition, you are seriously injured, and your fighting power is almost zero. If you meet the people of the 10,000 Swords Pavilion at that time, do you think they can protect Ning Qing?" What Su Li said flashed in Wen Tingshan's mind. The anxiety on his face changed for a few seconds, and finally turned into helplessness and bitterness. "You are right. I can't go to her now, or I will only put her in danger and hurt her in vain." But he really missed her so much that his reason was almost beyond his control. His whole body was almost out of control. "Bear it." Su Li was expressionless and said lightly, "Ning Qing has been waiting for so many years. She doesn't care about waiting for 2 more months. If you go like this, you will be separated from her forever. It's better not to go." When Tingshan took a deep breath. Whenever he thought of the words 10,000 Swords Pavilion, his heart seemed to be pressed by a huge mountain. He said, "How will you deal with the people of the 10,000 Swords Pavilion? It depends on how much you know about the pursuers." Su Li smiled at this moment and said, "Take good care of yourself. Otherwise, you can't even deal with a pursuer." "Yes." When Tingshan's eyes were firm. Finally, he completely obeyed Su Li. As time went by, it was the day when Su Li kept the appointment. From the east gate of Yunjing City, after walking for dozens of miles, you could see a lake with a very wide view. Because it looked like a bow, it was named Sky Bow Lake. It was very cold on the lake in winter. It was really unwise to go boating on the lake. But at this moment, there was indeed a ship with several decks drifting gently on the lake. In the warm room of the ship, Su Li and Ling Li, who wore a jadebone mask, were sitting face to face. There was a small tea table in the middle. Ling Mo stood straight outside the warm room and let the cold wind blow his face. Around the ship, there were people of Sholu cult. After a cup of tea, Ling Li lifted the teapot and added a cup of tea for Su Li. His clear and melodious laughter sounded on the lake. "Mr. Li, you are really brave. You come to drink tea with me alone. Aren't you afraid that I won't have a good feast?" Su Li smiled slightly and replied lightly, "Since I am here, I will take it easy. Child Ling Li, why don't you take off your mask and tell me why you call me out this time?" Ling Li chuckled and gently took off his mask. His face was as young as Su Li's. He looked calm, but his heart was not as calm as it seemed. He wore a mask because his disguise skill had not reached the peak. Warriors of the inborn realm could still see the clues. But this person couldn't even see whether he disguised himself or not. Did he really show his true face? "What are you thinking about, Hierarch?" Su Li took a sip of tea, but she was confused. She could see from the subtle changes in his expression that Ling Li seemed to have a trace of hostility to her identity. Where did this hostility come from? Ling Li was revealed to be absent-minded. He disguised a smile and shook his head. "Nothing. Today, I invite Mr. Li to come here to thank you for helping Qinghu cure the Lijua pill. I also have a question." Ling Li didn't ask about the rainy night in the Wu family. He got the answer from Ling Qinglan. It would be troublesome to ask again. Su Li secretly thought that as expected. She put down the cup and nodded, "I'd like to hear the details." Ling Li slightly pursed his lips, and there was a hint of tension in his starry eyes at this moment. He asked, What is the relationship between you and Su Li? Su Li's expression was slightly stagnant. What was this? Her identity was seen through so quickly? No. Not yet. Su Li suddenly realized what Ling Li's hostility was. Her mind immediately became complicated. Seeing that Su Li was silent, Ling Li's heart sank slightly, but he remained calm on the surface. He continued to ask, "Why are you hesitating? This question shouldn't be too difficult. You are definitely not the relationship I imagined, right?" Ling Li's palms between his knees slowly clenched into fists. When his patience was about to run out again, Su Li finally raised her head and smiled carelessly. "What is the relationship between me and Su Li? What does it have to do with child Ling?" Ling Li was tense for a moment, and then he forced himself to relax and continued to respond, "Nothing else. I was saved by Miss Su in those years, and I dare not forget her kindness. You and Su Li are from the same hometown, but why didn't she mention it when I was recuperating in Miss Su's place? I feel strange, so I ask this question." Su Li's smile faded a little. At that time, the Linli building had not been built yet, and there was no Mr. Li. But obviously, she couldn't explain it to Ling Li. "She mentioned you to me, but since she didn't mention me in front of you, she must think that saving you is just a trivial thing, just like saving a cat or dog on the street. It is not worth mentioning, and she will not meet you in the future." Hearing the faint words, Ling Li's eyes immediately became slightly cold. "Mr. Li, are you provoking me?" The atmosphere in the pavilion instantly became hostile, as if there was a snowstorm blowing, and the warmth was gone. Chapter 212. Ling Li emitted a frightening momentum. His sharp face was full of coldness. He looked at Su Li quietly as if he was looking at a dead person. Now, he was very angry. Although he didn't understand why, it didn't prevent him from fighting against Mr. Li in front of him. There was a voice in his heart that if Mr. Li didn't fight against him, he might have one less obstacle. Ling Mo stood in the wind and snow and noticed the atmosphere in the warm room. A trace of worry flashed in his cold eyes. No matter what Master did, he would support him unconditionally. But if Master really fought against Mr. Li, the consequences. Time passed by for a few breaths, but it seemed that several centuries had passed. As Ling Li took a deep breath and sat down again, the atmosphere in the room returned to ease. He finally gave up the impulse in his heart. With more burdens, he had to consider more. He was no longer the mercenary who always acted alone and had unparalleled spirit before the time travel. He was Ling Li who controlled the future of the Ling family and the fate of the Enmore cult. Su Li closed the half-opened jade bottle between her knees and sighed in her heart. It was the best not to fight against them. The Linli building absolutely supported the Enmore cult, but it couldn't be a part of it. She had to keep this in any case. If her identity was exposed, everything she had done would be in vain. "Sorry," Ling Li. Su Li smiled slightly and apologized. "My analogy may be inappropriate. If it annoys you, I apologize in advance." Ling Li was slightly shocked. Why did this person's attitude suddenly become less hostile? "Sect Master Ling invited me here because you're afraid that my winery will affect your sect. Please don't worry about this, Sect Master. As Miss Su Li said, since I took her recipe, I will manage it well and let people in the world drink good wine. The Linli building has no ambition and will not get involved in the Dahan country. I will make it clear here. Please rest assured, Hierarch Ling." Then, Su Li smiled and drank up the cold wine in the cup in one gulp, without any hesitation. But this explanation made Ling Li more doubtful. Since the Linli building had no other demand, why did it take action? All the people in the world came for benefits, and all the people in the world went away for benefits. What did Mr. Li want? After that, the two had nothing to say and kept quiet. They drank a cup of wine and had their own thoughts. When the time came, the banquet finally ended on a bad note. Su Li thanked him. She tiptoed on the surface of the lake and floated away, leaving Ling Li who was full of worries. After he came to this world, with the modern knowledge he brought, he built up a strong and mysterious force like steel in less than 10 years. He thought that there were not many things in the world that could baffle him. But since Su Li appeared, There were more and more things he didn't understand. Master, it's late. Let's go back first, or we will be found by Madam. Ling Xian came out from the back of the ship and whispered to Ling Li. Ling Li responded and glanced at Ling Mo without a trace. Ling Mo was expressionless and had no reaction. Ling Mo was expressionless and didn't respond. Ling Mo didn't dare to say it in front of Ling Xian, which meant that Ling Xian had done other unspeakable things in addition to the affairs of the cult. After thinking for a moment, Ling Li ordered to go back. He didn't ask Ling Xian whether he should wait for her to confess or wait for him to find out everything and then ask. He needed to think about it carefully. At this moment, a rather strange scene appeared in the Linli building. In the middle of the underground adytum, Xian Jingju was tied up tightly and looked depressed. Fang Yuan, Chu Qingning, Yin Xuetong and Fang Mu stood in the room and looked at each other. Then they turned their eyes to Wen Tingshan at the same time. Wen Tingshan was puzzled and said in a deep voice, "Why are you looking at me?" Chu Qingning touched his panda eyes and pushed Wen Tingshan out of the door. "Come on, Protector Shan. Let's go out and talk." Wen Tingshan was pushed out of the adytum helplessly, and the other 4 people also came out. Except for Fang Yuan, the others all laughed, which made Wen Tingshan more depressed. He argued, "This person spies on the Linli building for no reason. He must have bad intentions. I caught him and left him for Su Li to interrogate. What's wrong?" 2 hours ago, Xian Jingju had been secretly inquiring about the news since he saw Su Li come into the Linli building that night. But no matter which intelligence force, they knew nothing about the relationship between the Linli building and Su Li. Some people even thought that he was unreasonable and drove him out. In desperation, Xian Jingju could only sneak into the Linli building alone to explore. Unfortunately, he happened to enter the room used by Wen Tingshan for healing. Wen Tingshan's spiritual mind was so sharp that he noticed it the moment Xian Jingju appeared. Poor Xian Jingju was in the inborn 8th hurdle. Under Wen Tingshan's surprise attack, Xian Jingju was knocked unconscious and fell to the ground. Then there was the scene in the adytum. The 4 people who knew the relationship between Xian Jingju and Su Li felt strange. Now, even if Su Li didn't want to contact Xian Jingju and Su Yu for the time being, she couldn't. Half an hour later, the sky was already pitch black. Su Li came to the Linli building. After listening to Wen Tingshan's narration, she suddenly fell into silence. After a long time, she changed into a cyan robe and changed into the appearance of Mr. Li. Then she came to the underground adytum. Squeak, the low and hoarse sound of the door opening was extremely harsh in Xian Jingzhou's ears. He suddenly raised his head, and his eyes lit up. When he saw Su Li's strange face, he was stunned. This was a face that he had never seen before. He hesitated and said a word, "You, Mr. Li." Su Li was expressionless and looked at him. At this moment, Xian Jingju was no longer a pedantic scholar with the atmosphere of a marketplace. Instead, he exuded the great righteousness of a decent person who practiced the authentic mental method of Xiangong. This was the real Xian Jingju. "Are you Mr. Li?" Xian Jingju couldn't help but exclaim. Nowadays, there were many mysterious rumors about Mr. Li in major intelligence forces. Although he was not as famous as the equally mysterious and powerful child Li, the name Mr. Li was also well known in Yunjing City. The reason why the name was famous was not that what the Wu family did on a rainy night was known. Otherwise, the Linli building would have been destroyed more than 18 times. What really made Mr. Li revered was his unpredictable medical skills. The elixir that Ling Qinglan took was the frightening Lijue pill. But after such a long time, he was still alive and kicking. How could it not make people of the Lianxia cult shocked? The Lijue pill was related to the foundation of the Lianxia cult. After many investigations, they finally found the name of Mr. Li, but they still didn't know which force he belonged to, what he looked like, and whether he was a man or a woman. It was a family scandal for the Lianxia cult, and it couldn't be spread out. However, there were a few spies in every sect, so the reputation of Mr. Li spread out. It became more and more exaggerated with the word of mouth of people in the martial arts circle. Some people even said that Mr. Li was an old monster who had lived for hundreds of years. He was obsessed with medical skills, so he could cure the Lijue pill. No one in the world could compare with him. Even Enchanting was not as good as him. Under the influence of such rumors, Xian Jingju suddenly saw that Mr. Li was a teenager. How could he not exclaim? It turns out that you are the owner of the Linli building. I should have thought of it. Xian Jingju calmed down and shook his head. He smiled bitterly and said, according to the rules of the martial arts circle, I admit defeat if I am not as good as others. It's up to you to punish me. Su Li smiled indifferently and said, Xian Jingju, to tell you the truth, I have been paying attention to you and your wife. Su Li's first sentence made Xian Jingzhou's bitter smile become cold. What do you want to do? Do you remember the pot of wine that you and your wife drank on the first day of the opening of the Linli building? Xian Jingzhou's expression was tense, and he felt that something was wrong. What happened to the pot of wine? Su Li chuckled and said, Don't worry. The pot of wine is not poisoned. Otherwise, how can you and your wife be fine after so many days? But for you who are on the path of practicing the mortal world, whether it is poisoned or not, is there any difference? When Su Li said the last sentence, Xian Jingzhou's face finally changed. This person knew everything. Chapter 213. Su Li paced and said with a light smile, People of the secular world can't be disturbed on the way to practice mind. A drop of water should be repaid with a spring. So, I exchange the 2 pots of wine for your loyalty to the Linli building. Is it too much? Xian Jingju was livid and growled, Despicable. You are not a gentleman to do this. Despicable? Su Li raised her eyebrows and said, When did I say that I am a gentleman? Besides, what I did was an overt scheme at most. You drank the 2 pots of wine willingly. I didn't force you. How is it despicable? You. Xian Jingju was angry for a while. Su Li clapped her hands. Fang Yuan, who was guarding outside the door, immediately opened the door and said, Go and invite Su Yu. Tell her that Xian Jingju is a guest here and can't afford to pay for the wine. Fang Yuan glanced at Xian Jingju, who was anxious and angry. He nodded and left. Stupid woman, don't come. Xian Jingzhou's heart seemed to be pressed by a stone, which was very heavy. They were schemed against and forced to join a force. They were not willing to be controlled by others. But now he was here. According to Su Yu's character, she had to come. Sure enough, not long after Fang Yuan went out, Su Yu went into the Linli building with a kitchen knife. When she saw that the wine tables in the lobby of the Linli building were as neat as a mirror, and when she saw Fang Yuan standing at the entrance of the underground adytum and guiding her to go down, she finally realized that something was wrong. Su Yu's boorish face could not hide her exquisite thoughts. Her thick eyebrows twitched as she asked, Little brother, what exactly did my master do? Just tell me, I'm listening. Fang Yuan looked as gentle as possible and whispered, Proprietress, you will know when you go down. My master is waiting for you downstairs. Su Yu looked slightly serious. She hesitated for a moment and finally followed Fang Yuan down the stairs. There was an underground adytum in the Linli building. The secret of the Juyu winery. Su Yu quietly turned the kitchen knife in her hand and pointed it at Fang Yuan, who showed his back to her. But at this moment, Fang Yuan stopped and turned his head and smiled. Proprietress, this way please. Su Yu was not embarrassed at all. She naturally put away the kitchen knife and pushed the door pointed by Fang Yuan. Creak, Su Yu slowly opened the door. As soon as she saw the scene in the room, she immediately moved from stillness to extreme. Without saying a word, she lifted the kitchen knife and flashed to stab Su Li's neck. Fang Yuan's complexion changed greatly, but it was too late to stop it. Su Li's pupils shrank in an instant, and her body seemed to turn into a boneless snake. She avoided Su Yu's fatal blow, but she also retreated from Xian Jingju. Su Yu was happy when she saw this. She didn't want to kill Xian Jingju. After she forced Su Li to retreat, she immediately cut the rope that bound Xian Jingju. Success. Lady Boss is really an impatient person. If there's anything, why don't we sit down and talk? Why do we have to resort to violence? Su Li chuckled, without any sense of exasperation. Su Yu's heart skipped a beat. She finally knew why Su Li was so calm. It was because even if the rope was loosened, Xian Jingju was still motionless. Jingju? Su Yu was confused. Xian Jingju patted the rope on his body and stood up with a wry smile. We have been tricked. Su Yu's face changed slightly. She had long felt that something was wrong. Was it intentional that the Linli building invited them to drink last time? Su Li patted the cyan robe that was cut by the wind of the knife. She laughed at the right time and said, "Why do you make such a bitter face? If you join the Linli building, there will only be benefits and no harm." Su Yu snorted and put the kitchen knife in her waist pocket. She said, "Those in power like sweet words most. Do you think that I will believe whatever you say? If you are sensible, let us go. The money for the 2 pots of wine. Give us time, and we will pay it back 100 times. Xian Jingju sighed at the moment. He could see the situation better than Su Yu. This person had planned for a long time, and he came to the Linli building. How could he let them go easily? "Mr. Li, I just want to ask, what is the relationship between Su Li and you, and the Linli building?" As soon as Xian Jingju said this, Su Yu's cold face immediately turned into astonishment. This young man was Mr. Li? Su Li actually had a relationship with the Linli building? Su Li raised her eyebrows and asked in a deep voice, "Where did you know the relationship between Su Li and me?" Su Li's answer was equivalent to a disguised acquiescence of the relationship. Xian Jingju breathed a sigh of relief and accepted his fate. He said, "A few days ago at night, I saw you and a beggar entering this restaurant, so. Otherwise, how could I easily take risks when I knew that the Linli building was weird?" Su Yu listened and became more silent. She was angry in her heart. Xian Jingju had been hiding these words from her. "I see." The scene of that day flashed in Su Li's mind. On that day, when Tingshan suddenly attacked her. Her state of mind was indeed a little chaotic. She didn't find that someone was spying on her. Fortunately, it was only Xian Jingju and his wife who knew it. If it was someone else, Su Li narrowed her eyes and said, "Su Li and I do have some relationship, including the wine of the Linli building. Half of the industry income of the Linli building belongs to her." That was, friends. The thought flashed in Su Yu's mind. Her resistance to the Linli building was not so serious, but she still had doubts in her heart and did not dare to join rashly. "After joining the Linli building, I will not interfere with your life. If it is not necessary, you are still the proprietress of the Juyu winery. Only when it is necessary, I will ask you to help. There is no danger to your life. And, you can enjoy the wine of the Linli building. It doesn't charge you." Su Li smiled slightly and added another bargaining chip. Xian Jingju was so tempted that he almost agreed. Fortunately, Su Yu stopped him in time. At this moment, another person pushed the door and came in without saying hello. Su Li looked back helplessly. She knew it was Wen Tingshan. This person was obviously used to be free in the Wanjian sect. He didn't respect her, the temporary leader, at all. Mr. Li, Wen Tingshan almost spilled the beans and broke into a cold sweat. At this time, he just heard the reason from Chu Qingning and felt a little guilty. After all, Xian Jingju was Su Li's uncle, and he didn't show any mercy at that time. "Why are you here? Go back and lie down. Do you really think my medicine doesn't cost money?" Su Li scolded him coldly. When Tingshan smiled apologetically and stepped back, "I'll go back now." This was the second time that he acted without authorization. It was normal for Su Li to be angry. Su Yu stared at Wen Tingshan's face and blinked, as if she saw something incredible. Just as Wen Tingshan was about to step out, she asked in surprise, "Senior fellow apprentice." Wen Tingshan trembled violently and looked back incredulously. When he saw Su Yu's face, he frowned and was vigilant. "Who are you?" Then he winked at Su Li, indicating that she shouldn't let this woman go. If his identity was known, the Linli building would be in big trouble. Su Li didn't move, but raised her eyebrows slightly. Her aunt seemed to know Wen Tingshan. What was going on? "You are really senior fellow apprentice Wen." Su Yu saw Wen Tingshan's familiar frown. Even though it had been 8 years, she still recognized him at a glance. He was undoubtedly the first senior fellow apprentice. She immediately changed her fat face and revealed a beautiful face that was somewhat similar to Su Yun's. Senior fellow apprentice, I am Su Yu. Junior sister apprentice Su Yu? Wen Tingshan's voice immediately rose. He turned back a few steps and grabbed Su Yu's shoulder. He said excitedly, "You are still alive. I always thought you had died outside. Fortunately, senior fellow apprentice, it's so nice to see you." Su Yu cried with joy. She completely ignored Xian Jingzhou's strange gaze and threw herself into Wen Tingshan's arms. The appearance of Wen Tingshan immediately eased the relationship between Su Yu and her husband and the Linli building. In addition, Su Yu joined the Linli building without asking Xian Jingzhou's opinion. Obviously, Su Yu trusted Wen Tingshan very much. Since Wen Tingshan was willing to join the force, there would be no problem. But she didn't know that Wen Tingshan was also driven into a corner by Su Li's bewitching potion and was quickly pulled into the group. Su Li rubbed her eyebrows. Su Yu was also a member of the Wanjian sect. The reason seemed to be traced back to a long time ago. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.